Hello everyone, welcome back. This is S.C. Coleman, author. In this video we are going to be talking about, reading from, and reviewing a book. Trade and Empire, the British Customs Service in Colonial America, 1660 to 1775, Thomas C. Barrow. Now before we get into this, there's something to mention about why it is important. The first is that even though the focus has changed, the message remains the same. Submit or die. Now, in this time period, of which we are lied to about considerably, especially here in the United States, this is one of those books that those who portend to be our masters today would very much desire never to be read nor seen. This is one of those books they would like to eradicate and replace with one of their so-called text books. Now, I've seen very few books that have no text in them, other than, say, notebooks or things like that. But it is indicative of the word game which they play. And it's the same word game they were playing at this time. The difference is that at this time, the focus was on trade. Merchants were the focal point of the day. They were the abused or otherwise damaged party in the long struggle for, it's not about trade rights. See, that's the whole point, is that on its face it seems like this is about trade. This is a trade dispute, simple, clean cut, no problem. But it's not really about trade. Just as today it's not really about children. Today children form the focal point of the same conflict, the same prelude to war. And just like at this time, it's not really about the children, it's about something else. That something else is contained within the word sovereignty. See, they create their sovereign citizen gambit, their stereotype, with the intent of vilifying that word alone, sovereign. But regardless of the changing definitions, the revitalizing of the language, or all of the other nonsense that they do, the concepts remain the same. And it's that they repeat the same message. In fact, just like today, they assume or presume obedience. The school systems of today are arrayed in a conglomerate of force. They use various mechanisms to do this, but it is very obvious, and it is coming from the same repeated message: submit or die. And when are you going to put your children in school? It comes from the simple presumption that you have a duty, a simple duty, to put your children in school, and that schools have a stronger claim to them than any parent could. That's the same argument going on here, is that it is the duty of the colonists to blindly follow and do what they're told, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, and that the presumption is that they will do it anyway because it is quote-unquote the right thing to do. So, let's get into it, and when we read this, we will discover how many similarities exist from then and continue today. Page 14. So instead of reading the entire book, which would be pretty insane, I took notes about the most important and applicable sections, and I will just read from those. The Origins of the Colonial Service, Chapter 1, page 14. The establishment of a new agency, new imperial agency, mind you, called for the preparation of an elaborate series of instructions and directions. The collectors assigned to each colony received a detailed list of special orders. Before entering on their office, they were required to give bond and take an oath before the governor in their colony for the faithful performance of their trust. They were to determine the best location for a customs house and to appoint deputies to cover the outlying areas. They were to see to it that the masters of all ships not having been given bond to return to England report to their office with detailed information on their cargoes before any enumerated goods were loaded on any vessel. The duties were to be collected while careful accounts were to be preserved of all transactions, with close attention being paid to the detection of possible frauds. They were warned against one possible fraud in particular. Since ships having previously given bond to return to England had to pay no duties, the collectors were to see that no goods supposedly intended to be put on board such vessels were instead actually loaded on a non-bound ship. More generally, they were to check all imports coming into the colony to make sure no commodities were arriving directly from Europe without a stopover in England. They were to insist that every incoming ship report to the governor immediately on arrival to prove it was English-owned and manned. They were to be certain that the governor sent home to London the required lists of entries and clearances, while they themselves sent home duplicate lists as well. Finally, they were ordered generally to see enforcement of all acts of trade and navigation, particularly the bonding provisions, seizing all transgressors. Page 17. Appointment of customs officers in each of the colonies was not the only measure taken to complete the enforcement system. The effective operation of the acts of trade conceivably could be supplemented by extending the preventative precautions into foreign countries, where many of the evasions originated. Obviously, English customs officer could not be stationed in foreign ports, but use could be made of the diplomatic and consular officials abroad to report on English shipping trading illegally in their areas, and appropriate instructions were consequently sent to such personnel from time to time. Special agents were even employed occasionally to travel abroad to search out violators. Edward Randolph himself, at a later date, was sent out on such a mission to Holland, discreetly to inform himself of transgressors and, if possible, to bring the culprits back to the next port of England for trial. More important to the future operation of the enforcement system was the use made of the Royal Navy. By the Act of 1660, the Navy was authorized to seize foreign vessels trading in English waters. Unfortunately, the later act gave the Navy no power, so the colonists could claim with some justice that ships of war were not entitled to make seizures for violations of the Act, but that of 1660. So, the important part to note there, I believe, is the use of the consular element. One final precaution was taken to ensure the success of the colonial operation. Since the custom officers in the colonies were far removed from the authorities in London, some sort of regular overall inspection system seemed desirable. A further check was provided in 1681 with the appointment of William Dyer, that's spelled D-Y-E-R, as Surveyor General of the Customs Operations in the Plantations. Dyer, formerly collector of New York, had been driven from that colony by the local authorities who had prosecuted him as a false traitor for collecting unauthorized duties. On the grounds that the New York courts were incompetent to try his case, Dyer managed to have himself sent to England for trial, where he was speedily exonerated. At first he was reassigned as collector for Pennsylvania and the Jerseys, but then the London authorities decided to make use of his experience in a different way and pushed through his appointment as Surveyor General. In fulfillment of his new assignment, Dyer made a general inspection of the customs service in each colony, traveling from Bermuda to New England between 1683 and 1685. In 1685, he was recalled, and Patrick Main, or Maine, M-E-I-N, went out in his place. These surveyors general had the authority to examine into the workings of all the acts of trade, to investigate the conduct of the various customs officers, to suspend or appoint officers as required, to search out illegal goods, and to seize violators of the trade laws, etc. And now we're going to move on to chapter 2. Page 21. Chapter 2, Early Years in the Colonies. Edward Dix, first customs officer in Virginia, apparently had been unwilling to continue in his office after the 250-pound salary he had received prior to the Act of 1673 was changed to a percentage allowance of receipts. In his place, Giles Bland, an unwise selection, was appointed collector. Bland's father, a London merchant with connections in Virginia, had earlier written an essay condemning the acts of trade and favoring Dutch participation in English colonial commerce. Giles, who first went to the colony to look after his father's large holdings there, was young and, in his father's opinion, somewhat of a hothead. Generally, Giles Bland was not a man to respect established authority, and nowhere in the plantations was there a more authoritarian regime than that of Governor William Berkeley in Virginia. Even before his appointment as collector of the customs, Bland was involved in controversy of major proportions. In attempting to settle his family's affairs, he had stirred up a heated dispute with Thomas Ludwell, secretary to the province and one of Berkeley's closest counselors. Ludwell charged Bland with having brought to Virginia forged documents which were to be used to claim property not rightfully belonging to his family. Inflamed by too much liquor, Bland challenged Ludwell to a duel, and when the secretary did not appear, Bland fastened Ludwell's glove to the door of the State House as a mark of his cowardice. As a result of this impertinence, Bland was fined £500 by the House of Burgesses. It was not an auspicious debut. That, I think, is an interesting anecdote, and of course seems like it was almost planned. Appointed collector, presumably through the influence of his father, Bland continued his feud with the authorities, but this time enforcement of the Acts of Trade, not personal honor, was at stake. Governor Berkeley's position was quite simple. The Acts of 1660 and 1663 entrusted enforcement to the governors and to such officers as they saw fit to appoint. The Act of 1673 imposed certain duties and authorized their collection by deputies of the Commission of the Customs. Berkeley would see to enforcement of the acts, and the customs officers could collect their duties as best they might. In September 1675, Bland sent a long letter to the governor in which he declared that the collector was not responsible to the colonial authority but was an employee of the customs commissioners, to whom he judged himself liable to render an account of my actings in the said office and to none others. However, he added, the governor's support was essential, since without your honor's assistance, the commercial regulations cannot be put into effectual execution. So far, Bland reported, instead of cooperating, the local authorities had done everything possible to impede his work. One captain who had cleared properly with the collector had been forced by the secretary of the colonial government, Ludwell, to surrender his original clearance and to take out another. At the same time, Ludwell had cleared a ship on his own authority without the knowledge of Bland and refused to give the collector any details of his cargo or destination. Similarly, for want of accurate information, Bland had seized one vessel which had properly entered, and the governor opening himself to prosecution for faulty seizure. And on the basis of these complaints, the collector asked the governor to assist in four ways: by appointing a public customs house for all shipping coming into the New York and James rivers, by lending his official approval to the customs deputies stationed at outlying areas in the colonies, by backing up the customs officer with certificates of authority from the governor himself, and by seeing that the collector was provided with copies of all bonds taken by the governor's agents. And in general closing observation, Bland reported that the acts of trade were violated daily. European goods were being introduced illegally, and enumerated commodities being exported without payment of the duties. The governor's answer was immediate. The Council of Virginia judged Bland's letter be an affront to the dignity of the colonial government and suspended him from office. While Berkeley personally told the collector that if he attempted to clear any ships, he would, according to Bland, lay me by the heels withal calling me rogue, villain, puppy, and such like. The collector of the casual or local revenues was empowered to act in Bland's place. Giles Bland may himself have been responsible for many of his troubles, But he was not the only one to resent and oppose the authoritarian regime of Berkeley and his coteries of favored planters. Part of Bland's difficulty arose from the position as an outsider intruding on the prerogatives of the established clique that ruled Virginia. Another outsider, Nathaniel Bacon, was the author of the first great colonial rebellion, which, among other results, effectively put an end to the contest between Berkeley and Bland. As a consequence of Bacon's uprising, Governor Berkeley fled the colony on August 3, 1676. Bacon himself died unexpectedly on October 18th of the same year. Between those dates, Virginia was in the hands of the revolutionary government, one of whose most ardent partisans was Giles Bland, a collector of His Majesty's customs. The ultimate collapse of the rebellion after Bacon's death cost Giles Bland his life. In the bloody vengeance exacted by Berkeley upon his return, Bland and many other participants in the uprising were hanged as traitors and rebels. Even before the end of the rebellion, however, Bland had lost his collectorship. On August 21, 1676, the king ordered the customs commissioners to find a replacement for the wayward official. In all probability, Bland would have been removed from his collectorship, even had he not participated in Bacon's rebellion. The customs officer alone could not effectively enforce the acts of trade. If they were at odds with the local authorities, there were two possibilities: to replace the customs officer or to remodel the colonial government. Of the two, the former was by far the easier, if not necessarily the wiser course. For the moment in Virginia, cooperation between the local government and the royal agents could best be achieved by the appointment of more diplomatic customs officials. It was at this point that the English government adopted a system of multiple collectors for Virginia in place of the single officer formerly relied upon. Aside from providing better coverage for the numerous creeks and rivers of the colony, this arrangement prevented any officer, such as Giles Bland, from exercising too much personal authority to the irritation of the local magistrates. Most indicative of the effort made to achieve harmony at this time was the appointment of Philip Ludwell, Bland's old adversary, as one of the new collectors. Ludwell's selection, in fact, was an example of what came to be the predominant characteristic of the organizations of the customs staff in Virginia. Throughout the rest of the colonial period, the customs officers in that colony were chosen largely from the ranks of local aristocracy. In this way, the English government sought to gain cooperation in the Old Dominion from the local government. One result of this policy was that history of the customs service in Virginia thereafter was generally peaceful and with no repetition of the unsettling Bland incident. The Virginia story was replayed in the Carolinas with one major variation. In Virginia, the royal collector Giles Bland participated in a rebellion against the established authority. In the Carolinas, the collector represented the legal government authority and was the victim of a revolt against his administration. On November 16, 1676, Thomas Miller was commissioned collector at Albemarle in the Carolinas. Sailed for the colony in the company with newly appointed Governor Thomas East Church. Stopping at Nevis in the West Indies, East Church met a wealthy widow and took hold of the opportunity to marry her and dispatch Mr. Miller for Carolina. East Church made Miller president of the council until his arrival and gave him very full and ample powers. In this way, the royal collector arrived at Albemarle as a legitimate acting head of government. A peculiar situation developed in the Carolina settlement. As the Lord Proprietors later pointed out, the illness of the harbors forced the settlers either to send their tobacco overland to Virginia or to depend on merchants from New England, who were the only immediate traders with them. In the circumstances, the New England sea captains exercised a great deal of influence in that part of Carolina. When the news first reached the colony on the appointment of new customs officers, there was a general uproar. The local authorities were warned by some New England merchants and others that it would be a great inconvenience to submit to this payment, and that the New England men did intend to raise their commodities double if such payment were exacted from them. In obedience to instructions, the council appointed Valentine Byrd as acting collector to receive the duties levied by the Act of 1673 until the new collector arrived. But so dependent was the community on supplies provided by New Englanders that a compromise was soon arranged whereby the visiting merchants were given a refund out of every collection. Miller, who arrived in Albemarle in July 1677, made his first official action in an order to the acting collector to account for all the receipts he had collected. The rebate to the New Englanders was ended, and between July and November 1677, Miller gathered in 1,243 pounds sterling value in old and new receipts and seized goods. Even though this amount was collected in commodities and not in specie, it represented a tremendous imposition on the struggling community. Along with his work as collector, Miller assumed a full authority as governor and dealt with the people in a firm manner. He settled a conflict with the Indians and, in his own words, brought the people who were in a miserable confusion by reason of sundry factions amongst them to a reasonable good conformity to his Majesty's and the Lords Proprietors' laws and authority. Actually, what Miller had accomplished was to unite the feuding factions in opposition to his government. Previously, not everyone had been allied with the interests of New England traders, who, although they might furnish needed supplies, also through their monopoly of the market could obtain tobacco at very low rates. Miller managed to alienate both factions, and his fall consequently became merely a matter of time. In November, Captain Zachariah Gilliam arrived from London with a cargo of arms and ammunition. According to Gilliam's testimony, he made entry with Miller as required, but the collector, not content merely to consider his present cargo, asked Gilliam how much tobacco he had carried away on his last voyage. When the captain said nearly 180 hogsheads, the collector insisted on payment of the enumerated duties for that previous load, to which Gilliam replied that he had paid the king his customs in England, and did not judge his majesty desired his customs twice. Still, Miller insisted on payment and threatened the captain with arrest should he not comply. Gilliam's arrival was the spark that was needed. The weapons he gave the inhabitants for defense against the heathen were turned against the collector. Miller was imprisoned for a time on Gilliam's ship, and then tried on charges of having expressed treasonable words against the Duke of York and the king. The collection of the customs reverted to normal, and with the appointment of one of the rebels, John Culpeper, in Miller's place, it is probably no coincidence that the goods Miller had gathered in as payment for the duties he collected had not yet been sent out of the colony. The rebellion was nicely timed to prevent that shipment, and Culpeper took the goods into his care, confiscating all the customs records at the same time. Fittingly enough, the foreman at Miller's trial was one of the traders from New England. The absent governor, who finally arrived in Virginia in the middle of these events, was forcibly prevented from entering the settlement at Albemarle by the rebels and died in Virginia shortly thereafter. Miller himself, along with his surveyor, escaped eventually to England. There he had Culpeper, who had gone to London to present the rebel story to the proprietors, arrested, charging him and Gilliam with overthrow of the lawful authority in Carolina. In this case, much depended on the attitude of the Lord Proprietors. At first they seemed inclined to support Miller in a lukewarm fashion. Miller did have full and ample powers from East Church, but he did many extravagant things, alienating the people. On the other hand, the proprietors said Gilliam was involved in the rebellion, and the other leader, Culpeper, was a very ill man, having some time before fled from South Carolina, where he was in danger of hanging for laying the designs and endeavoring to set the poor people to plunder the rich. Commissioners of the customs were quite explicit as to their position. They recommended that Miller and the other officers be restored to the employment and estates and be fully repaired for any damage done them. In their opinion, it should be made highly penal for the future to oppose the collectors or collections and collectors, and the governor and all authorities should be enjoined to give the countenance and assistance thereunto. Two factors worked to Miller's advantage in the hearings on his complaint. First, the Crown officials were tempted by the thought of recovering all the lost revenue that had been taken from Miller by Culpeper. And secondly, the proprietors were more concerned with restoring order to their territory and with making it profitable than with upholding the royal authority. During the hearings on this case, the Earl of Shaftesbury, the spokesman for the proprietors, had presented their argument as outlined above. Miller may have acted unwisely, but he had ample powers to act for the absent governor. When the case came to trial, however, Shaftesbury completely reversed his position. He interceded for Culpeper, and the Lord Proprietors now stated that Miller, without any legal authority, got possession of the government of the county of Albemarle. Since his was not a legal government, there could be no rebellion in the eyes of the law. Consequently, there was no case against Culpeper and Gilliam. In the final settlement of this affair, the only casualty was the royal authority in Carolina. Approving certain measures which seemed the best method for recovery of the arrears of customs due to His Majesty, the Privy Council dropped the case against Culpeper and declined to reinstate Miller and the other officers to their posts in the colony. At the same time, however, they ordered that Miller and the others should have satisfaction for their personal losses and be freed from any vexatious suits in the future. A replacement was sent to Carolina for Miller, who was given a customs post in England. The long-range effect of this failure to uphold the authority of the royal agents in Carolina was made apparent to one of Miller's successors, George Muscombe, who became collector at Albemarle in 1687. Muskamp attempted to get a conviction in a local court against the ship which he had seized, admitting that his evidence was not of the best. Muskamp sourly noted that it really made no difference, since the court announced that no matter what the evidence, it would throw out the case, claiming the benefit of their charter against me. Since the charter had been granted after passage of the first Navigation Act, the colonial court asserted that the colonists were not bound by its provisions. In such a situation, Muskamp correctly observed, it will be difficult to maintain the acts of navigation in due force here. In due course, Muskamp found his position in Carolina hopeless and obtained transfer to Maryland. Carolinas were not the only proprietary colony to make the operations of the customs staff difficult. In Maryland, the son of the proprietor, Lord Baltimore, was the first collector. On the death of his father, the new Lord Baltimore recommended Christopher Rusby as his successor in the customs post. Although the proprietor himself selected the new officer, the two did not work in harmony for long. By 1681, Rusby was in England to present his complaints, while Lord Baltimore was urging his removal for misconduct and treasonable words against the Duke of York. Once again, as in Virginia, the trouble lay in the competing jurisdictions of the royal collectors and the local authorities, particularly the collectors of the casual revenues in the colony. While Rusby was in England, responsibility for the customs operations devolved on the surveyor, Nicholas Babcock. Lord Baltimore and the acting collector differed on the question of whether ships sailing to Ireland should pay the tobacco duty imposed by the Act of 1673. Babcock insisted that they should. Baltimore overruled him and ordered him to clear certain vessels without collecting the duties. The dispute was carried to England, where it was settled in Babcock's favor. Lord Baltimore received a severe reprimand and was ordered to pay the sum lost to the revenue through the interference. For the moment, Baltimore's concern for the possible threat to his charter led to a period of calm relations, but in 1684 the proprietor left the colony and placed a member of his council, George Talbot, in charge of the government. In October, after drinking heavily, Talbot picked a quarrel with Rusby, who had recently returned to his post, and killed him. The fight was preceded by sharp words concerning the conflicting authorities of Talbot and Rusby. Talbot was taken to Virginia, but eventually was released under sentence commuted to 5 years' banishment. Neither the death of Rusby nor the departure of Talbot ended the struggle in Maryland. The words of the captain of the naval ship stationed in Chesapeake Bay, reporting that no officer of the customs in Maryland can live without a good guard, were perhaps extreme, but Rusby's successor found that little changed. In April 1685, the new collector, Nathaniel Blackiston, wrote home that the officials appointed by the colony were interfering with his work. For example, he noted a local agent of the colonial council would seize any ship he thought Blackiston might have his eye on. Then that agent, Nicholas Sewell, Lord Baltimore's stepson, would make an arrangement with the captain, and at a mock trial the ship would be condemned and sold at a token price, the purchaser being the same captain. The English were slow to follow up the threat implied in the commissioner's letter. This is a different section. The Act of 1673 may have been aimed primarily at the New Englanders, but not until 1676 was another official embassy from the king sent to Massachusetts. This time the pressure for action came partly from John Mason and Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who had claims to New Hampshire and Maine and who opposed the intrusions of Massachusetts on those areas. Edward Randolph, related to the Masons by marriage, was chosen to carry a royal letter to the Bay Colony, thus commencing his long career in the plantations. The letter Randolph carried to Massachusetts ordered that colony to send agents to England to answer to the king for the conduct of their province and to explain their position concerning the claims of Mason and Gorges. After presenting his communication and receiving what he considered to be insulting treatment, Randolph returned to London full of information on New England and its perversity. The decision to extend the customs service to New England and the selection of Randolph as the chief officer followed. The wisdom of sending Randolph to Massachusetts, despite the fact that he might be personally obnoxious to the people, was questionable. The new officer, who during the next 26 years was to play such an important role in the development of English policy, was a peculiar man. He combined an intense devotion to duty with terrifying persistence in pursuit of his objectives. Imprisoned many times, continually insulted and abused, Randolph took it all in stride and returned for more. Yeah, that's nice. But many of his difficulties seem to be of his own making. Armed with his own righteousness, Randolph irritated when he should have soothed and alienated what little support he might have possessed. His view of the colonists as congenital rebels and rascals may not have been far off the mark from the English point of view, but a wiser man would have displayed more flexibility and practicality. Randolph met every problem head-on, and when he met defeat and humiliation, so did the authority of England and her colonies. Rigidity was both Randolph's greatest strength and his greatest weakness. In an unusual outburst of sprightly verse, some Bostonians welcomed Randolph back in December 1679, when he returned as royal collector with these words among others. "He that keeps a Plantagenet custom house, one year may be a man, the next a mouse. Your brother Dyer hath the devil played, made the New Yorkers at the first afraid. He vapored, swaggered, and hectored, who but he, but soon destroyed himself by villainy." The reference to Dyer in New York was particularly fitting. The New York collector had been harassed by the colonial courts until he eventually had returned to England for redress. Randolph, too, soon found the provincial courts the source of his many problems. Within 6 months of his arrival, he had missed being imprisoned only by the interference of the governor, who ordered that his bond be accepted for bail. The legal action against Randolph arose from a seizure he made of a ship coming from Ireland, whose captain instituted a 800-pound personal suit against the collector, and the collector had to depend on the same provincial courts, which so willingly ordered his imprisonment for the prosecution of whatever seizures he might make. Between 1680 and the end of 1682, Randolph made 36 seizures, which he took to trial. All but 2 were acquitted. At times his investigations were forcibly resisted, as in the instance when the man he left to guard some illicit goods was set upon by 4 or 5 persons and badly beaten, while the goods were carried off to safety. So, on to a different part. When Randolph referred to the Acts of Trade, he meant more than the various regulations laid down by Parliament. He had in mind the mercantilist principles embodied in those acts and in every aspect of Stuart colonial policy. Along with the remarks quoted above, Randolph also said that the New Englanders had unmasked themselves as an hypocritical and wicked Bigoth people, and that force is the only argument to convince and oblige them to a dutiful and entire submission to the Crown and the laws of England. England sought the entire submission of the colonies not as a desirable extraction, but with an explicit purpose, to guide the development of the colonies to the best advantage of the mother country. The Dominion of New England itself was created in the interest of trade, defense, and a closer dependence of the colonies on England. If Restoration colonial policy was based on mercantilism, then the heart, the keystone of that policy, was found in the Acts of Trade and Navigation. In that sense, Randolph was quite correct to lay the blame for the rebellion on the trade laws. They were the visible sign of a general attempt during the period of the last Stuarts to execute, in fact, the vision of empire held in theory by so many English men. There was a coherency, a completeness to Stuart colonial policy that was not to be evident again for 70 or more years. What could be said of the Colonial Customs Service at the end of the first 16 years of experimentation? First impression would be that it was a failure. One aspect of the general English administrative intrusions on the colonies, the customs officers' experiences more than anything else illustrated the difficulty of the undertaking and the depth of colonial opposition. Some valuable lessons had been learned, however. One problem involved the relationship of the customs staff to other authorities in the colonies. The feud between Bland and Governor Berkeley of Virginia, for example, had seriously impaired the operation of the system in that colony. It was clear that the conflicting responsibilities of the various officials needed definition. The naval office, whether used by the governor, the proprietor, or as in Massachusetts by the colony, had interfered with the customs operations. It too required attention. Next chapter, chapter 3, a new policy defined. Characteristic of the cautious approach of the of the 25 years that William and Mary had their successor, Anne ruled England. 19 were occupied with war with France. In the circumstances, colonial administration problems became of secondary importance. Not only were English energies directed elsewhere, but extension of the European conflict to the New World made colonial cooperation a major concern. It was not a time for forceful coercion or recalcitrant subjects. Characteristic of the cautious approach of the new king and queen was the remarkable continuity in governmental personnel maintained, not just in the customs service, but in all branches of administration between the old order and the new. In London, important civil servants such as William Blaithwaite adjusted to the altered situation with a minimum of discomfort, while in the colonies, the continued importance of Edward Randolph emphasized the fact that the new regime intended no immediate radical break with past policies. King William's employment of Randolph, in fact, must have dismayed many of the colonists who had joined in the uprisings of 1689. Responsible for much of the form and direction taken by the Stuart colonial administration, Randolph had been so attuned to the realities of his position that merely a year before the Glorious Revolution he had heard with perfect equanimity of the intention of James II to send Catholic priests to the colonies. Randolph even suggested that the priests might be very useful in wooing the Indians away from their allegiance to the French. Yet under Protestant William, this most faithful of Stuart employees was not only continued in governmental service, but promoted to a higher post. Randolph became Surveyor General of all His Majesty's customs in America. Brought to the throne by a successful revolutionary movement, William and Mary wisely made use of the experiences and knowledge of all those in the government who were willing to serve the new regime. Perhaps much of the continuity maintained by King William with the personnel and policies of his predecessors stemmed from the fact that the central problems of colonial administration remained basically the same. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the colonial uprisings of 1689 did not remove the fundamental point of friction between England and her colonies. England still insisted on her paramount position politically and economically within the empire, while the colonists endeavored to exercise as much home rule as possible. Consequently, continued conflict between English authority and colonial opposition was to be expected. If there were any doubts on that point in London, events related to the colonial customs service soon made the truth apparent. I think that that's important to mention because it sounds to me like Vatican intentions happening behind the scenes. That seems like evidence. There's others, but it's sort of neither here for there as far as the overall understanding of what's going on here. Now the commissioners felt that the service in New England might operate more smoothly if the chief officer were a native of the region. Such a man would have more extensive knowledge of the area and might be more accessible to the inhabitants. Consequently, the post of collector in New England went to Jaleel Brenton, a native of Rhode Island who had been in London as agent for that colony. In line with the same policy of employing native sons, Sir William Phips became governor of Massachusetts under the new charter. Brenton's experiences quickly demonstrated that, although England might have a new king and Massachusetts a new charter, the problems of administration did indeed remain the same. Brenton's first undertaking was a mistake as he tried to punish a ship owner who, according to reports, openly paraded both his past violations of the trade laws and his intention to continue to evade them in the future. Brenton took the owner, Nicholas Page, to court on a charge of having shipped tobacco directly to Scotland in a ship, the Salisbury, in the year 1689. At the trial, Page argued that William and Mary's act of indemnity covered such former misdeeds and the court agreed with him, dismissing Brenton's case without further hearing. Eager for revenge, Brenton seized the Salisbury again, this time for importing European goods without going through England. Actually, Page's ship had taken on its cargo on Liverpool, but Brenton thought its papers were faulty and that some goods had been taken on elsewhere. He prosecuted the Salisbury successfully in the Massachusetts courts, but unfortunately the Commissioner of the Customs did not support his case when it went to London on appeal. They felt the ship's papers were in order and that Brenton's charges were unreasonable, so the verdict was reversed. Once again, the collector had been defeated by Nicholas Page. In the contest with Page, Brenton was motivated partly by personal pique and partly by a desire to make an example of a known violator of his commercial regulations. His failure did little to enhance the prestige of his office, In this instance, discretion would have been wiser than official zeal, but Breton's disputes were not restricted to merchants and to local courts. By 1693, he and Governor Phipps were open enemies, the break becoming irreparable after Phipps led a crowd of about 50 people to a storehouse where goods seized for illegal entry had been placed, and laying violent hands upon Breton, pulling and dragging him about the wharf of the said storehouse, forced the collector to return the goods to their owner. This bizarre episode with the royal governor and the collector of His Majesty's customs cavorting in such a childish manner also did little to increase the English authority in New England. And now we will see about Philadelphia. At Philadelphia, Randolph found, "They harbor privateers who have brought in a great booty. It is an asylum for debtors from New York. Prohibited goods are landed there, and no law to prevent it." Of course, that's also the opinion of Randolph's or Edward Randolph. So, with a grain of salt and all that. For some time, the groundwork had been prepared for the reform of the Customs Service. As early as 1692, the Treasury had asked the Customs Commissioners for suggestions on what should be altered or improved. Primarily concerned at the moment with the Customs Service in England itself, but the reply of the Commissioners indicated that some thought had also been given to problems in the colonies. In their report, which was based on items included in draft of a bill, part whereof had long been since prepared, the Commissioners proposed that all ships belonging to English subjects, either in England or in the plantations, be registered upon oath in the port to which they at that time respectively belong. We see that going on today. No ship would be permitted to have its name altered, but on changing hands, new ownership and port of location might be added to the old registration. Every ship would have to have a certificate of such registration with it at all times. Sounds extremely similar to what they do with motor vehicles today of all sorts, including trailers and other accoutrements and, basically everything really. And they almost, anything that moves just about. Now here's an interesting one. This has to do with Scotland. Associating the program for customs reforms with the Scottish threat, as suggested by those two members of the House, was an astute move. For many years, Scotland and England had been at odds on the subject of trade. The Northern Kingdom wanted to share in England's commercial empire, while the English were irritated by Scottish encroachments on trade with the colony. In 1695, the Scots took the initiative, creating their own East Indies Company. The Darien Company was to have a monopoly of commerce with Africa, America, and Asia, and all goods imported into Scotland by the company, except tobacco and sugar, were to be duty-free. Passage of this act marked a major national effort by Scotland to bolster its participation in the exploitation of the world's resources. The English response, predictably, was immediate and angry. From their point of view, the Scottish Act was a brazen attempt to intrude on their monopolies. So great was the resentment that King William saw fit to remove his representative in Scotland from office for having approved the Act, and Parliament was mobilized to counter the Scottish threat. A majority for any measure introduced a block to Scottish plans could be easily obtained. Consequently, associating general customs reform with such a measure would help to ensure passage. No man was more suited to the task of relating the operation of the colonial service to Scottish encroachments than Edward Randolph. Of course. The letters he had written since his return to the colonies in 1692 had been filled with references to illegal traders from Scotland. And Captain Meach, whose ships he tried to have condemned in Virginia, was a Scotchman and an old transgressor. One of the vessels he prosecuted in Maryland had been captained by a Scotsman, and the jury which frustrated Randolph's plans had been summoned by a sheriff who was a Scotch Irishman, and who returned a jury composed of known Scotch and the others their friends. Thoroughly informed on affairs in the colonies, enthusiastic in his opposition to Scotch encroachments, Randolph was an ideal lobbyist for a new parliamentary bill. In 1695, Randolph presented 2 reports to the commissions of the customs, the first which related directly to the customs service in the colonies. Under 11 headings, the Surveyor General discussed the weaknesses and suggested remedies. First, naval officers accepted persons of small or no estate to act as security for captains and also to readily cancel bonds and receipt of forged certificates. This loophole could be corrected if the governors were required to accept only substantial citizens as securities, a penalty of forfeiting £1,000 if they approved insufficient security. Secondly, since the courts displayed a general partiality biased by private interests, a court of exchequer should be erected in the colonies with judges and attorneys general appointed by the king. Also, because there is no penalty for presenting forged documents, it should be enacted that masters using such papers should suffer 12 months imprisonment. Randolph was particularly distressed at the freedom with which captains unloaded their cargoes before entering. To prevent this invasion, any ship discharging its cargo before entry should forfeit £200, while anyone assisting such enterprises should pay £10 for the first offense, $20 for the second, and forfeit whatever small boats they used in their work. If bond were given in England before a ship sailed to the plantations, a printed certificate of that fact should be in possession of the captain, otherwise no ship should be permitted to trade in the colonies. Since many Scotsmen entered the colonies to act as agents for merchants in Scotland, all such factors should be considered aliens and prohibited from engaging in trade. Referring again to bonds, Randolph complained that forfeited bonds were never prosecuted unless the offending party was present in the colony. It would be better to order that such bonds were to be prosecuted whether or not the offenders were available, and certificates of such forfeitures sent to England to be acted upon there. And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, yeah, he just sort of lays out as much nastiness as he can come up with, as horrible as he can exact, basically vengeance on, what he has said before, his level of hatred and how much he despises colonials and everybody else because they're all, villains and criminals, etc. Boy, we really don't hear that crap today, do we? I'm being sarcastic, of course we do. We hear it everywhere. It's broadcast all over the place. Your very existence is a crime. Boy, that's a level of hubris which is very prominent and common today. In the second report, Randolph used the Scottish threat to elaborate once again one of his favorite schemes, reminiscent of his suggestions leading to the establishment of the Dominion of New England. Arguing that the Scots planned not only to let themselves into trade of all His Majesty's plantations, but also to purchase a settlement on the southern shore of Delaware Bay, Randolph prophesied that such a colony would soon rival the Dutch islands as a center of free trade and frustrate all English attempts to control the commerce of the colony. Actually, such a threat was not only far-fetched but absurd. The Scots could not purchase a colony in Delaware Bay without royal permission, and the area was generally included in the Proprietary of Pennsylvania. Even if the Scots instead acquired one or more islands near the continent, as Randolph suggested, they hardly had the navy or merchant fleet to rival the English as effectively as the Dutch had done. Yet on the basis of this remote possibility, Randolph commended a complete reorganization of the American colony. It was a transparent attempt to employ scare tactics to pressure Parliament into underwriting a general reform program. Oh, here's a good one. These are search warrants. Now, mind you, today the search warrants that we have are the same as these. The same. They're not intended to be different. They are the same. No matter what stupid arguments they portend or say or whatever, these are the same. It's going on today as it was then. Essentially, they put back in place the crap that all of the wars and people died fighting over, and that it all got put back. It's crazy. Perhaps the most important feature in the new act was the extension of the Act of Frauds to the colonies. This act, passed in 1662, had protected the customs officers in England against personal harm and had given them extensive powers of enforcement. Under that act, the officers were entitled to general search warrants, known as writs of assistance, and permitted the right to forcible entry in cases of suspected concealment of illegal imported goods. Now, these privileges were granted to the colonial officers. In their powers, rights, and obligations, they were made the complete equals of the officers in England. writs of assistance. And here in this next part, we will talk about the Court of Exchequer. It would seem to have been an intention of the framers to extend admiralty jurisdiction to the colonies, but to place a major reliance on other courts as well. Possibly they thought to make use of colonial courts of exchequer. Randolph has suggested that such courts could be erected in the plantations, and the Commissioner of the Customs had indicated that they could be established on the royal authority alone, without the intervention of Parliament. In England itself, the Court of Exchequer, not the Admiralty, had cognizance of violations of the Acts of Trade. Logically, it would be expected that such an arrangement should be extended to the colonies. In fact, there is evidence that this was done. Certain colonies, including Bermuda and New York, did provide for courts of exchequer, and by the end of the 7th century, most governors had been instructed to assemble such courts as needed. However, in practice, exchequer courts in the colonies proved unworkable. The colonists had little knowledge of the complex procedure of the English court, and since the personnel of such courts as were established consisted of local inhabitants, the new tribunals showed as little desire to support imperial regulations as the other colonial courts. For these reasons, the courts of the exchequer never became a permanent feature of colonial administration. In 60 years' time, this failure was to have important consequences. Claiming that there were no exchequer courts in the colonies, the colonists launched a determined attack on the writs of assistance by customs officers. Since under the laws these writs could only be issued by the Court of the Exchequer, there was a certain validity to the legalistic quibbling of the colonists on this issue in the days of James Otis. Before the moment, in 1696, the important fact was that establishment of admiralty courts in the colonies had been given parliamentary sanction. The details had yet to be worked out, but a major step forward had been made in the effort to achieve enforcement of the Navigation Acts. So I think that's a good explanation, but it's not. It doesn't really explain what the exchequer courts do. It just explains that the writs of assistance are supposed to come from the exchequer courts alone, and they're just using them at will, which is what they do today. They use these so-called search warrants at will. They get rubber stamped, and they go in and break down doors and shoot people's dogs and their children and do other craziness like that. But it's the same deal in this period. These writs of assistance are a evil with which the people's hatred is spurred on. But the Court of Exchequer, it said the colonials couldn't understand the complicated mechanism of its function. And I would say today our current courts don't even compare to the Court of Exchequer. The Court of Exchequer this time period probably was even simpler and easier to understand. Not necessarily that the colonials didn't understand it. I do not give credit to that statement that the colonials didn't understand how the Courts of Exchequer work. The court system that we have today is intentionally convoluted because it is a front, a facade, and a fraud. 59, we get closer to what we look at today. The continuous marching of the same plan, essentially, implementation. The registration of shipping, it says, nor was the registration of shipping left to colonial control. Even though the Royal Customs Staff took part in the registering of vessels, provision was made for the keeping of a general register in England to prevent frauds. In all its varied aspects, the Act of 1696 centered authority on London. Every action was to be checked there, every official concerned with the trade laws appointed or approved there, nor did the passage of the Great Act and elaboration of the system. In the months immediately following, 3 important steps were taken. A network of admiralty courts was created in the colonies, royal advocate generals were sent out to protect the king's legal interests, and the colonial customs officers were made wholly independent by being transformed into established members of the English service. Those actions of colonial customs service came of age. So, the City of London has been pointed to, in many cases, as an evil globalist control center, especially when it comes to the metal markets and the Bank of London's hypothecation of silver, particularly. But in this context, we see the old enemy of globalism and the idea of centralization to a distant foreign interest. They have centralized control of, most importantly, lists. Here today in the United States, we have lists for everything, but the most prominent lists are those that are quote-unquote secret. The secret lists, especially the secret targeting lists, in which individuals, organizations, and various groups, as well as regions and entire, in many cases, nations, are put onto many lists. And many of those lists are kept secret, and people's lives are destroyed simply because they have been put onto a list. Same thing here. They want control by means of a list held and controlled from afar. Boy, that's so familiar. It's just very familiar today. Now in this chapter, chapter 4, the system takes shape. We will talk about New York and someone named Leisler. The officer who followed Dyer in New York, Lucas Santon, had been removed in 1687 by Governor Thomas Dongan for gross mismanagement of the provincial revenues. His successor, Matthew Plowman, had a short and stormy career. He was appointed rather hastily in November 1687 to replace Santon. But within less than a year, William Blaithwaite wrote to the governor of New York that he had received a further character of Mr. Plowman, which was not to his advantage. He was quickly removed, and Chidley Brooke was appointed to the post, which he still held in 1698 when Randolph made his official visit to New York. New York in 1698, and for many years thereafter, suffered from the effects of the uprising of 1689. The revolutionary government of Jacob Leisler, which controlled the colony after the fall of the Dominion of New England, had ended with the execution of Leisler in 1691. But the political divisions caused by his event kept the colony in a state of unrest for many years. Chidley Brooke had been a member of the council and the government which had put Leisler to death. Until 1698, this political connection with the anti-Leislerian faction was to his advantage, as the royal governors supported that same group. But in 1698, Richard Coote, Earl of Bellamont, became governor of New York, and, disgusted with the mismanagement of the colony under the former administrations, sided with a faction loyal to the memory of Leisler. One of the new governor's first actions was to examine the conduct of Brooke in his two offices. Bellamont arrived in New York in April 1698. By the end of June, he had suspended Brooke from all his duties. The governor reported that he found negligence everywhere. Trade moved freely where it would, the customs officers were lax in their duty, and the collector was the worst of all. To support his charges, Bellamont pointed out that one small seizure made within a month of his arrival put the whole town in an uproar. They looked on it as a violent seizure of their property. This reaction, he suggested, was an indication of the previous laxity of enforcement, which led the inhabitants to think it was their right to trade as they wished. Now, onto a different section. Currituck in North Carolina, Quay reported, was a small hole where much mischief is yearly done. While the naval officers in Pennsylvania still continued to oppose the customs operation, generally the Surveyor General reported that to secure the trade of the colonies from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas, a small brigantine with an active master and about 20 brisk men was needed. Such a vessel would save the Queen the expense of sending a small man of war, which hitherto hath been done, with ill results. The captain of the man of war disliked the assignment, and do find one pretense or other always to be at anchor. Quarry wanted the brigantine placed on the immediate authority of the governors of Virginia and Maryland. In his northern tour, Quarry found New England somewhat improved, although Connecticut was still impossible. That charter colony generally opposed the trade laws. Quarry wrote that he had turned out all the collectors in his government and put others in their places, which I hope will make some alteration, though I must own that I have no hopes of preventing illegal trade. Rhode Island, too, was not a happy picture. Newport had risen to a major port in recent years, and there was much illegal trade, which could not be stopped as long as the colony retained its charter privileges. But the Oldville and Boston showed signs of improvement. Formerly, there had been a great deal of illegal trade, but the war had reduced Boston's commerce generally, and now the impoverished city was more amenable. Still, the extensive coastline and numerous opportunities to unload goods beyond the sight of customs officer made the trade violations easy. Corey suggested a sloop to cruise continually off the New England coast. Now here's an interesting one. The deputy system in New England had been under attack for some years. As early as 1699, the Board of Trade had complained of the situation with the Earl of Bellomont, governor of New York and Massachusetts, concerning, in their opinion, Bellomont had written the board that Brenton's deputies were generally unreliable. The man in New Hampshire was a broken marchant, or marchant, of Boston who has no good character, while the deputy in Rhode Island consorted with pirates. Bellomont did not hold these faults against Brenton personally, rather it was the system. I believe a man that's honest and of substance too would hardly accept of a deputy collector's place. The governor recommended separate collectors for Rhode Island and New Hampshire, adding, I should also humbly advise that all officers of the revenue may be Englishmen, and not of these plantations by no means, for they have little interest and friendship to gratify, and to speak plainly, they seem here to hate those that are English born as if they were foreigners. Boy, that's a grudge that you still find, well actually that's a grudge you find pretty much all over the planet today, because the globalists teach everywhere to a misrepresentation of the United States and also general hatred. Oh. Now we will get a description of how all these mechanisms work. By 1710, the problem of the Colonial Naval Office had been largely settled. In each of the above customs districts, the collector's work was intimately involved with that of the naval officer, so much so that the latter might be considered a regular part of the customs service. The Act of 1696 had required that the naval officer give bond for performance of duty to the customs commissioners in England, and gradually even the appointment of these officials was removed from colonial control. The effort to combine this office with that of the collector had failed, mainly because of the English enthusiasm for a system of checks and cross-checks, in which every official would have another peering over his shoulder, limiting the opportunity for dishonest transactions. Still, the naval officer had been made to play this part in the customs operation, and in effect at no expense to the exchequer. The English were provided with another agent of enforcement. Confused as their relationships might often appear, each of these officials, in theory at least, had distinct and important functions. The central figure of necessity was the collector. On him depended full responsibility for the enforcement of the acts of trade and navigation, and the other officials took their lead from him. Essentially, the collector's task was to see that all goods were entered properly in his presence, that no cargoes were loaded or unloaded without his warrant, and the required duties were paid on enumerated items, and that proper bonds were given when necessary. He also is required to have the various acts and regulations on hand for the information of the captains and owners, and when necessary to seize in the king's name the goods and possibly the ships of transgressors. In the latter instance, the collector acted as the informer in legal prosecutions following seizure. He had to check bonds and coquettes, keeping an eye out for forgeries and see that the sureties offered were acceptable. His own accounts were to be transmitted regularly to England, attested to by the comptroller, where one was present, and the surveyor general, and sworn to before the governor. He also, of course, had to transmit the receipts from the enumerated duties to England, when possible in specie or bills, but in commodities if necessary. The matter of quarantine inspection and enforcement was another of his concerns, and the collector was not himself to engage in trade. The comptroller had the completely negative function of acting as a check on the activities of the collector. Such had been the design for this office in England since the time of Edward I. He was to keep his own records of transactions in the customs office, examine and sign all accounts and dispatches jointly with the collector, and generally share responsibility for the proceedings at this port. In fact, the comptroller entered more actively into affairs than his position required, frequently carrying out the instructions of the collector or acting for him in his absence. The surveyor and searcher, of which only one example, that of New York, appears in the 1710 listing, was responsible for the actual inspection and control activities in the harbor. Under his supervision, the outdoor officers did their work: tide waiters boarding incoming vessel, land waiters watching ships at moor, and searchers examining the loading and unloading process. Only the larger ports warranted such officials, and in most cases all these activities would be combined in one or two men. The officers sent to Nova Scotia in 1713, for example, had the general title of collector, surveyor, and searcher. In the ports where they were found, the ordinary searcher, as the title indicates, would inspect incoming and outgoing vessels and persons of whom sinister suspicions might be had. Tide waiters, or tidesmen, were put on board incoming vessels to ensure that no goods were clandestinely landed before the mooring was reached, and land waiters took charge at the quay to see that no unauthorized loading or unloading took place. Again, in most cases, all these functions were combined in one or two officers in any given port, at least until the system became more complex and efficient at the close of the 50-year period. Most of the surveyors listed on the colonial establishment were in actuality writing surveyors, a rather different matter. These officials had been found useful in England, particularly along the Scottish border, where they patrolled their districts on horseback, guarding against smugglers and illicit traders. The surveyors in Maryland and Virginia were of this type. Chapter 5, Reports from the Field. In line with the usual colonial practices of obstruction, during Birchfield's investigations, the Assembly of Maryland passed an act declaring that no legal actions pending in any county courts should continue longer than 12 months. In a provincial or high court of appeals for more than 19, or in a court of chancery more than 25. As if this act were not pointed openly at Birchfield, in the same session the Assembly passed another piece of legislation disabling Thomas McNamara, who was acting as counsel for the king, from performing his duties. McNamara, in order to procure some relief against the said act, came into England. The act was repealed and he soon after died. In general, Birchfield met with so many difficulties and obstacles in his prosecution of these suits, both from the parties and the gentlemen of the country, that many of them could not be brought to a conclusion or a hearing. He failed to finish all the cases within the time permitted by the act, and by color thereof some of the suits have been dismissed with costs, the judges there imagining that the king and his interests, though not mentioned, is bound by these acts. As a final harassment, the Deputy Secretary of the province later brought suit against the Surveyor General himself for fees he claimed were due to him for filing bills, returning writs, and so forth during the above prosecutions. So on one Sunday, Birchfield found himself arrested as His Majesty's debtor and ordered to pay the fees. It was of little comfort to him that eventually one legal authority in London, on hearing that the Lord Proprietor was exempted from such fees, tentatively expressed the thought that the Crown ought to have equal privilege and exemption from the Lord Proprietary. In attempting to straighten out past administrative irregularities and ensure further compliance with acts of trade, Birchfield encountered one of the basic truths of the customs officer's situation. Obstruction, not cooperation, was usually to be expected from the local colonial authorities, while in particular the provincial courts and legal apparatus would be employed to delay and frustrate the enforcement of undesirable regulations. There were, of course, the Admiralty Courts, and the question naturally arose as to whether these courts could be used for such prosecutions against forfeited bonds, thus avoiding the interference of the local judges, juries, and officials. However, Attorney General Sir Edward Northey in England put an end to such hopes when he declared that suits involving plantation bonds could not be heard in an Admiralty Court until and unless it should be expressly so authorized by Act of Parliament. Another official having difficulties with local courts was Nathaniel Kay, collector in Rhode Island. Kay, happening upon 5 hogsheads of claret, which had been smuggled ashore and concealed in a back house, left the wine in the custody of the sheriff and a guard while he searched for a cart to move the barrels. Before he returned, the owner came along with a number of people in a riotous manner and destroyed the hogsheads. As being armed with axes, they threatened to kill the officers in case they resisted. The collector knew better than to attempt to obtain redress in the provincial courts, which he had good reason to know were used by the trading people of the island. In arresting the customs staff for taking their just fees, and put them under very great difficulties, and take them in execution of their duties by the laws made there, which never had the king's sanction. But the collector wondered, what about the possibility of removing such cases to England and to be tried in Westminster Hall? The answer this time was yes, the trials could be heard in Westminster as permitted in Section 7 of the Act of 1696. Unfortunately, at the same time that this possibility was pronounced legally acceptable, it was recognized as an unworkable in practice because of the difficulty of transmitting not only evidence but the defendants themselves over the ocean. Kay and Birchfield had discovered, to their sorrow, that the legal machinery in the colonies could be employed most successfully to deter them from their assigned tasks. But the hazard was not only one they faced. There was also the use of open force. The destruction of the wine casks seized by the Rhode Island collector was a minor outbreak compared to slightly later events in Boston in December 1723. The brigantine, William and Mary, W. Whipple, master, sailed into Boston from Lisbon with a cargo of salt. Not only did it appear that Whipple had stopped above Boston at Piscataqua, that's hard to say, Piscataqua, and clandestinely landed some wine and oil, but the comptroller at Boston, obtaining a search warrant from the lieutenant governor, also found that Whipple had run 18 skins of Spanish leather and 12 jars of Spanish oil ashore in Massachusetts itself. William Lambert, the comptroller, exhibited a libel in the Court of Admiralty against the vessel and goods, and summoned the entire crew to testify, only 2 of whom appeared, but both gave evidence for the Crown. During their testimony in full court session, the abuse against the 2 witnesses became so violent that Lambert had to appeal to the court for their protection. The court was adjourned to another day, but when the new session opened once again, the witnesses were outrageously treated. When the hearing ended and the judge departed, some merchants and masters of ships, with a great number of other persons, in a violent and mobbish manner assaulted the said evidences, kicked and pushed them downstairs, and beat one of them so unmercifully, dragging him through the streets, that it is not yet known what may be the consequence. The intervention of the sheriff saved the unfortunate informer, but the threats turned on the customs officers, who were greatly abused and threatened with the same treatment. In forwarding this account of the events to the Treasury, the Commissioners of Customs added that the officers of Customs in New England, having at other times been insulted and abused in the execution of their duty, we humbly pray that our officers and their assistants may be protected in the execution of their duty. The Treasury Board decided. Oh wait. It continues. The Treasury Board decided that in this case the governor should advise the proper method of action, and the matter is referred to Governor Samuel Shute. Shute's answer was to request 3 independent companies of troops for his provinces, 2 for Massachusetts and 1 for New Hampshire. Shute would have stationed the troops at Fort William in the harbor and the town of Boston itself. All this, he said, would appear necessary from the many riots and disorders that have been committed in the town, and also from the complaints forwarded from officers of the Admiralty Court as well as the customs personnel. Once again, as in the Admiralty reports, Shute's advice was farmed out for expert opinion and no action taken by the Treasury. Shute's successors felt much the same 5 years later, as he wrote that, "I have seen so much of the temper of the people of this province that I humbly conceive that some of His Majesty's forces upon the British establishment will be necessary to keep them within the bounds of their duty," and he requested that 200 troops be sent to Massachusetts, similar to the independent companies posted at New York. In his report on events in Rhode Island, Nathaniel Kay had stated that the governor gave his utmost assistance, but the customs officials were not always so fortunate. In New York, Governor Hunter complained that the Surveyor General had removed Thomas Farmer, the collector at Perth Amboy in New Jersey, for non-residents. Although he had a deputy in port and lived right across from it himself, Hunter claimed that the replacement was much an absentee himself and a mere tavern keeper at that. This and the other charges levied against Birchfield by the governor stemmed from the rivalry between New York and New Jersey. But the governor was successful in driving Birchfield from the scene. Caleb Heathcote, who succeeded to Birchfield's former post by 1750, encountered much the same opposition from Governor Hunter, who asserted that the Surveyor General refused to install Francis Harrison as Surveyor and Searcher in New York, although Harrison had been commissioned by the Customs Commissioners themselves. Once again, the governor won his point and a candidate was awarded to the post. In October 1724, there arrived at Philadelphia the ship Fame, William Lee master, bringing in various Palatine families who planned to settle in the colony. Investigations showed, however, that under cover of this legitimate enterprise, the Fame had brought from Holland a large quantity of East Indies goods and various European manufactured items of a total estimated value of £20,000. A partial listing of the cargo included 1,000 gallons of arrack, 200 weight of tea, French and German brandies, wines, Burgundy, claret, and champagne, 17 barrels of gunpowder, cheese, sailcloth, cordage, and iron. It was even discovered that the owner of the vessel was a merchant in Rotterdam. John Moore, the collector, seized the ship in the king's name and placed 4 waiters aboard to guard the prize. During the night, however, some 60 or 70 people in disguise in a tumultuous and violent manner cut the Fame loose from its moorings and carried it down the river. According to Customs House reports, all but 2 of the waiters, being terrified by the menaces of these rioters, leapt overboard. The remaining guards being forced along with the ship, once below the city, the greater part of the prohibited goods were put ashore, while the 2 waiters were kept so closely confined that they could give no account to what places these goods were carried. Moore notified Lieutenant Governor William Keith of the rescue of the Fame on the 31st of October. Not until the 1st of November did Keith take any action, going then from Newcastle, where he was, over to the Fame. There he reported he was politely received by the merchant on board, who informed him that the collector had made a mistake and that all goods were covered by coquettes. Keith went back to Philadelphia and on the 3rd of November called the collector to his house, berating him for not following the ship downriver, while adding that if the proof of illicit activities that Moore had to offer satisfied his doubts, then he himself would go down to the ship and bring it back to the harbor. On the 5th, the governor did just that, not neglecting to seize the Fame in his own name on a doubt, as he put it, that the collector could prove his prior seizure. To Moore he made the offer that if the collector would drop his pretended seizure and depend on his, he would see to it that Moore would receive as much from it as he had from his own. Moore, he reported, declined this gracious offer, and so Keith proceeded on his own, taking the case to the regular provincial courts rather than to an admiralty court, because, as he asserted, the governors of Pennsylvania had no right to set up admiralty court or admiralty judges such as other governors possessed. Perhaps the most effective and universally employed restraint imposed by colonial assemblies on the efficiency of the customs staff was in the matter of fees. Nathaniel Kaner's report on events in Rhode Island touched on this question when he wrote that the trading people do frequently arrest the officers for taking their just fees. And Judge John Menzies of the Admiralty Court in New England had also observed how the fees in the court had been cut more than a third by the colonial authorities. Such interference by the colonial legislatures was made possible by the vague nature of the policy on fees. As illustrated by the situation in New York, in 1709 the Assembly of that province passed an act settling fees allowed to the various officers, including those in the Royal Customs Service. After studying England, it was ruled that the fees so established were too low and the act was disallowed. Instructions were forwarded to the Governor of New York to work out a list with the advice of his council. The result pleased neither the governor nor the customs officials, as the council set the fees so low that the governor only granted his consent because the officers otherwise would have been left with no legal fees at all. Similarly, 1 year earlier, the Assembly of Rhode Island had passed an act establishing a table of fees at a uniformly low level, with the proviso that collectors and naval officers found guilty of taking higher fees were to be fined. A warrant issued by any of the local justices of the peace would suffice to bring the offender into court. Such an arrangement provided a convenient method for harassment of overzealous officers, and case complaints made 7 years later showed the act was used exactly for such purposes. In January 1716, the new Surveyor General wrote to the Treasury that he had heard sometime that Parliament intended shortly to pass an act to break the proprietary or charter governments. This, he thought, was an excellent idea, as until such was done, it would be nearly impossible to regulate the colonial trade. With these offending governments removed and a better division worked out, it would then be possible to settle a revenue by customs and exercise or excise on the whole continent upon an English footing, which could be used to defray all the expenses of the several governments and pay for ships of war to guard the ports as well. Nothing, he added, can be more reasonable than that all the plantations and dominions abroad should be made to bear the expense they occasion, and not remain a dead weight on the nation that severely groans under the debts of which they have been, in a great measure the cause. If the assemblies refused to provide such reasonable revenue, he supposed Parliament might with justice do it for them, as there was no reason the subjects of this side of the ocean should have more privileges than those at home, where revenue on trade was a burthen the people of Great Britain have always with great cheerfulness laid on themselves, and is what they never expect to be exempt from. And that right there is the same haughty, holier than thou, religious, dogmatic perspective that we get from the United Nations of Europe today and Switzerland. Davos, the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum, etc. They seek to be, as they did then, complete masters of all for your own good, for your safety, essentially. What's that saying again? You will own nothing and be happy. And here we see it today. They force us to pay for our own abuses or abuses done upon us and occupation. And that's exactly what they plan to do with the colonies. They wish for the colonies to pay for their own subjugation. And that is the same thing they do to us today. The same thing. And once we get further, their haughty, hubristic, and petty perspectives in the quotations we see here. So bear with me a minute as I find the correct passage. Nor did the activities of the colonial legislators escape his notice. Remarking on their habit of passing acts intended to frustrate the work of the royal officials, Heathcote reported that the English policy of employing threats but no action was dangerous. The charter governments, for example, had frequently been threatened with loss of their privileges, but nothing further being done. They were inspired to greater abuses and confirmed in the absurd notion of their laws being sufficient in themselves. While they have a power, as they imagine, of making laws separate from the crown, they'll never be wanting to lessen the authority of the king's officers, who, by hindering them from a full freedom of illegal trade, are accounted enemies to the growth and prosperity of their little commonwealths. It's an interesting that these pretentious and pompous, haughty, arrogant, sort of pariahs of righteousness and good always love to use diminutive words, and specifically that word little. They're little commonwealths. The little group, a small fringe group, right? It's interesting. Every single time you hear that, you hear the tone of contempt, of haughty contempt, mind you. So a level of hubristic superiority that means that they may recognize the reality of things, but they use these words more as an insult than an actual observation. His researches on these matters completed, Archibald Cummings was ready for more ambitious undertaking. In 1722, he wrote home that with the proper urging, he could propose a scheme to raise a fund in the plantations which would not be burdensome. It's interesting how often this idea of a fund comes up. A national defense fund, for instance, like we have currently in the United States to fund a law enforcement occupation, military. And of course, they're not our laws, not the laws of the people, but rather the laws of the separate corporate institution that we currently today call government, and especially the education institutions and bloated universities and all of the other nonsense we have to deal with. The response was favored, and in November 1722, Cummins forwarded to England an 11-point program of startlingly comprehensive proportions. The title he provided indicated the general purpose of his proposals: a scheme for maintaining 5,000 or 6,000 regular troops upon the continent of America, and the raising of a fund for yea better support of governors and officers of yea crown in the plantations. And then one moment. I'm looking for the correct section. This is what I would consider probably the anti-preamble to the U.S. Constitution. If the U.S. Constitution's preamble, which came later, of course, is what we look at as the right preamble, this would probably be the preamble of the villain. Cummings pointed out just how it should be done, employing such a fund to free the hands of the royal officials, to provide for the defense of the colonies, to create administrative unity and conformity, and to ensure proper respect for the acts of Parliament, was a move these men, on the basis of their experiences, felt to be not only wise but necessary. In no other way could they envisage a solution to the troublesome and dangerous problems existing in the plantation. Archibald Cummings was not the only man to recommend the extension of the English Stamp Act to the colonies. In 1726, Sir William Keith, former Deputy Governor of Pennsylvania and himself once Surveyor General of the Customs, proposed various reforms, all of which he concluded would be of little purpose unless a sufficient revenue can be raised to support the needful expense. In order to which it is humbly submitted whether the duties of stamps upon parchments and paper in England may not with good reason be extended by Act of Parliament to all the American plantations. And of course we have currently today in operation that very Stamp Act in the form of purchasing stamps for post. Chapter 6, the English Scene. One moment. No. The composition of the Board of Customs Commissioners was so stable as to make it the 18th century counterpart of an organization staffed by permanent civil servants. A complete turnover of personnel never occurred. Death or retirement of a patent holder was generally the only way openings on the board arose, and only 4 occasions were as many as 4 of the 14 commissioners replaced in 1 year. Many of the members served for long terms: Sir John Stanley, 1708 to 1744, Sir John Evelyn, 1721 to 1763, Edward Hooper, 1748 to 1793, and Brian Fairfax, 1723 to 1750. Continuity was considered so important for the office that an unusual arrangement was made to ensure no lapse in the commissioner's powers and right to office on the death of a sovereign. Long tenure and special consideration in effect showed that in regard to the customs service, a certain subordination of political influence to effective administration was practiced. So that sounds very similar to what we would call the deep state today. And the deep state I would consider to be mainly financial. The deep state obviously being considered and known as a mechanism which people are governed against their will by individuals in the background who have no allegiance except to the quote-unquote administration. Relative freedom from political pressures was an asset, but it did not necessarily ensure complete efficiency. For implementation of its decisions, the board was dependent on the Treasury. In the 18th century, the Treasury was the largest of the departments of English government. So large, in fact, that a catalogue of its activities is necessarily incomplete. As distinct from the Exchequer, the Treasury properly exercised general financial control over the operations of the entire government. The Treasury Board, which consisted of the First Lord, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and 3 junior lords, carried on a voluminous and continuous correspondence. A partial list of departments and individuals included in their routine business gives some indication of the breadth of the Treasury Board's concerns. The Privy Council, Secretaries of State, the Customs Boards, the Admiralty, the Paymaster of the Forces, the Excise Office, the Exchequer, and the Auditor of Plantation Affairs, the Commander-in-Chief in America, the colonial agents, the Surveyor of the Wards in the colony. And of course, as usual, they control all of them, and the almighty dollar reigns is the same, and yet at this time it wouldn't have been called that, but it's still all about control of the money, or the flow of money. The next part that we see today is this use of the term Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, acting on their own right but in the name of another. The great advantage the Secretary possessed over the Board of Trade was the right of approach to the King. Because of this asset, the Secretary did indeed become the intermediary between the King and other parts of the British government. Of course, that means replacing the King. That's what that really means. The Secretary becomes the King because they become the intermediary between that and all other things. And that's what we have today. We have secretaries who subsume the powers of the executive office because they are the intermediary. If any one official had the power to bring unity to the determination of colonial business, the Secretary did. Unfortunately, like the Treasury, the Secretary had much more to consider than the plantations. Anything from diplomatic relations with France to trade agreements with small Mediterranean states were his province. In the 18th century, officials clung with might and main to all the prerogatives of their offices. Authority, even if not regular exercise, was not lightly surrendered. In truth, Lord Halifax was discovered in 1751 when he attempted to enlarge the powers of the Board of Trade. After 1715, what power the Board of Trade had possessed was taken from it by this increasingly important Secretary who often ignored it. Too busy to oversee everything, the Secretary only erratically concerned himself with colonial administration. The Board of Trade could not act without the support of the Secretary, and so a further wedge was driven between the creation and execution of an informed colonial policy. What a surprise. Now, here's the reason why an outright revolution did not happen. I believe this is the reason why. And it has to do with someone named Walpole. In the words of Basil Williams, inaction in the administration of the colonies was largely due to Walpole's set policy. Perfectly congenial to Newcastle's own inclination of interfering as little as possible with the colonies, England was the first of the Prime Minister's concerns. As illustrated by a remark he made in 1739, urged to force the plantations to contribute financial aid by imposing direct taxes there, Walpole replied, "I have Old England set against me. Do you think I will have New England likewise?" And here's an interesting development, is the use of, this is a hard word to say without sounding ridiculous in current American accent, of Falmouth, which would probably be considered by Scott Irish to be Fullmouth or Falmouth, Falmouth, and by the English to be Falmouth. Sam Waldo was a wealthy New England merchant with extensive land holdings in Maine. Having been second in command to William Shirley at the siege of Louisburg in 1745, Waldo felt entitled to special consideration. In 1756, he was in England petitioning for the payment of 1,340 pounds as salary for his service at Louisburg, plus 1,000 for personal losses. With difficulty, he received the 1,340 pounds, but nothing more. But there were other ways to take advantage of his position. With him in England was his son Francis. In March 1757, Francis Waldo, reporting to the Treasury that there was no customs house within 150 miles of his home at Falmouth in New England, requested that the port be made a customs district and that he be named collector. Sam Waldo, with his commercial connections, had no difficulty in persuading the most considerable merchants of the city to testify the need for a customs house at Falmouth, and Francis got his appointment. Not only were Nevin and Earl of Bath annoyed at this intrusion on their territory, but they were incensed by the partition that was decided upon. According to Nevin, the territory assigned to Waldo was even greater than had been first requested, leaving him with little of his own for a district. Consequently, Nevin requested that his Piscataqua port be extended 7 miles to the northeast and 20 miles to the south, in order to retain his hold over York in Maine, which Waldo's warrant assigned to the Falmouth district, and to expand to the southward to the Newbury River to offset the territory lost to Waldo. In this, at least, he was successful. The Earl of Bath felt this whole affair had all the appearances of a concerted job, and the possibility cannot be ignored that Samuel Waldo and his fellow merchants, faced with the arrival of a new official in place of the ineffectual Sully, undertook to make Falmouth a port of entry for their own convenience. Certainly Falmouth was hardly the busiest district. Francis Waldo depicted to the Treasury, and the American commissioners, after their coming in 1767, found the customs business there poorly managed in the extreme. It was an ideal location for ships on the way to Boston to stop off and unload any goods that might cause difficulty in the more strictly guarded port. Yeah. And here's an interesting part to note is, if Waldo's district was small and unimportant, Boston was one of the most active of all ports. The last collector, Richard Ackborn Harrison, has left us with a detailed account of his profits. Harrison's income schedule for the year 1775 was as follows. Salary, 100 pounds. Fees at Boston, 1,138 pounds at 11 shillings and 6 pence. Fees at Nantucket, 200 pounds. Share of seizures, 100 pounds. Now, we move on to Chapter 7, the fallow years. 134 to 135. So this is called the 4.5%. Any question touching the 4.5% received careful consideration in England. Not only was the revenue from that tax considerable, but the English authorities were free to use it as they wished. In 1726, for example, Governor Shute, who had been driven from his province of Massachusetts because of the bitterness engendered by the salary question, was provided for from this fund. Figures on the receipts from the 4.5% at the time for the passage of the Molasses Act are revealing. In 1727, over 20,000 pounds was paid into the exchequer from the source. From 1730 to 1733, receipts reached a low of less than 8,000 pounds a year. Immediately after Parliament enacted the Molasses Act, returns rose to a peak of over 40,000 pounds. Thereafter, they fell precipitously. The Molasses Act was permitted to become a dead letter was partially due to other steps taken to relieve the distressed West Indies planters, who gradually realized that one of their major handicaps was the prohibition against shipping their produce directly to European ports. Even the operation of the drawback system did not compensate for the increased charges they faced through being forced to ship via England. Consequently, they were at a disadvantage in competing for the continental markets. The planters petitioned Parliament for the removal of this restriction, receiving satisfaction in the Acts of 1739 and 1742, which, if they did not allow rum and molasses to be shipped directly to Europe, at least did remove the prohibition on sugar itself. This concession meant more to the planters than the unenforceable Molasses Act. It probably explains the failure of the bill to tighten the provisions of that act, which Parliament was considering in 1739. More important, perhaps, than this temporary muffler put on agitators for the Indies was the end of the Walpole era of international peace. In 1739, England went to war with Spain. Walpole's reluctant acceptance of involvement in a contest with Spain marked the beginning of the end for his long career. At the same time, the end of peace also fundamentally altered relations between the motherland and her colony. Cooperation and mutual goodwill were now more important than ever. It was not a time for coercive measures. In 1740, for example, an expedition was planned against the Spanish islands in the Caribbean, and all the colonies from the Carolinas to New England were asked to contribute levies. So seriously did the English regard this undertaking that Governor Belcher of Massachusetts, who had survived numerous other crises, finally was removed for his failure to collect the required number of troops. The exact extent of the trade in foreign molasses will never be known, but at a safe guess it was enormous. When the duty on molasses was lowered to 1 pence per gallon in 1766, and levied on both foreign and British products alike, there was no longer any need to falsify the returns. Between 1768 and 1772, imports listed as coming from the English islands fell from 326,675 gallons to 125,466. During the same period, foreign imports rose from 2,824,060 to 4,878,794 gallons, suggesting that false entry and not clandestine smuggling had been the main problem. In 1766, Massachusetts was reported to possess 51 distilleries, each producing 1 hogshead of rum a day, while New York had 12 such refineries. In 1762, 9,000 hogsheads of molasses were officially imported into Massachusetts. If only 1/5 of this amount, calculated at the conservative figure of 63 gallons to a hogshead, came from the foreign islands, of 2,835 pounds in duties should have been collected. Official receipts from the duty on molasses from all that continental colonies for that year were only 718 pounds. Since it is likely that more than 1/5 of the 9,000 hogshead was of foreign origin, the defrauding of the revenue was even greater than these figures indicate. And here we get an explanation by a Timothy Orne of how one method in which smuggling is done. The testimony of Timothy Orne of Salem earlier indicated how the duties on molasses were compounded for a fraction of the real amount. This same merchant provided a glimpse of another aspect of the illicit trade. After cautioning his captain about the changes in enforcement of the Molasses Act, Orne advised him to buy cotton, cocoa, cables, anchors, cordage, and canvas instead of molasses. These items Orne suggested should be sent home a little in a vessel as stores for the vessel that bring them. This use of ship stores was one of the frequent abuses of this period. Since every vessel was entitled to carry a certain amount of goods as part of its regular supplies, Orne meant that the items he ordered should be divided up and brought back in various ships as part of these stores. There would be no difficulty in passing small quantities through the customs, and if necessary, the officers could probably be persuaded at a reasonable price to overlook such false entries.
Okay. If such admissions could be offered in defense of the conduct of an official, how much worse the whole truth must have been. This impression derived from such accounts is of nearly total breakdown of authority prior to 1764. When an officer did perform faithfully, it was not necessarily just from the local inhabitants that he could expect trouble. In 1756, Robert Palmer, collector at Bathtown in North Carolina, seized a ship on the approval of the governor and the surveyor general. The vessel being condemned, and it and its cargo of salt sold at public auction. When the English merchants who had chartered the ship heard this news, they threatened to have the collector removed for doing my duty and complying with the acts of trade. The merchants claimed to have great interest with Sir George Littleton, which is probable since the ship's name was the Littleton. In October 1756, Palmer wrote the Secretary of the Treasury, whom he had met, pointing out that two had some interest at home, having obtained his post through the recommendation of the Duke of Queensberry. He pleaded with the Secretary to intervene with Sir George for him. Yeah. Nor were the merchants entirely dependent on the forced or voluntary goodwill of the officers in their ports. In those days of slow communication, authentication of documents was generally impracticable. Consequently, forged or false papers were difficult to detect and easy to obtain. In 1748, the Quincy brothers of Boston wrote to one of their captains about goods he was to purchase in Holland. On his way home, they advised him to go through the Orkney Islands, where he was to contact Andrew Ross, who was the only gentleman to be depended upon. Ross specialized in getting vessels cleared by the lump for so much without unloading. In effect, this meant that a Scottish customs official was providing false papers showing that ships had broken bulk in Great Britain and paid the proper duties as required by law. There was little a colonial officer could do in such a case. Outright forgeries were evident in another case in 1759. It was reported from New York that John Cannon and John Pintard of Newark, Connecticut, were the persons that had procured most of the fictitious clearances from the customs houses at New Haven for the merchants here. This information was supported by a letter obtained on a pretense from the unsuspecting Cannon and Pintard, who in their own words claimed that they had got several vessels cleared for 5 shillings New York currency, which have £10 for our trouble and expenses. Under the Navigation Acts, foreigners were not permitted to trade in the English colonies. But there were ways to avoid that provision also. In 1748, a Dutch ship for a time freely traded in the ports of Jamaica and South Carolina, claiming that the winds prevented her from reaching her destination at Curacao. The vessel obtained permission to dispose of her cargo in Jamaica. The trade was so good that she sailed away and soon returned with more goods, which again were sold at the same pretext. Finally, the South Carolina officials put an end to her career and had her condemned. Such flagrant violations were not really necessary. Charter parties were an easier and more subtle method. In 1758, Lieutenant Governor James Delancey of New York reported on the case of a ship belonging to a merchant of Boston, Joseph Rhodes, who had arranged to have a charter party drawn between him and one John Hodgson of Amsterdam. Supposedly the ship was engaged by Hodgson to carry goods from Holland to St. John's in the West Indies. In fact, the cargo of tea, rope, yarn, and other items was an improper cargo for the West Indies, and care was taken before the ship left Holland to obtain permission for a stopover at Rhode Island on the way to St. John's to receive instructions from Rhodes on how to proceed to the end of the voyage. Rhode Island was out of the way, and there had been plenty of time for such orders to have been given before the ship sailed. That Rhode Island, not Boston, where Rhodes lived, was chosen as a stopping point is evidence enough of the real intentions here. As Delancey pointed out, the purpose of these pretend charter parties was by securing liberty to touch at one of the English ports on this continent, privately land their cargoes and fraud of the laws of trade. This particular ship was seized and taken into New York, but condemnation was impossible since nothing could be said to be forfeited until actually landed. Since the Navigation Acts came under the category of penal statutes, they had to be construed strictly and cannot be extended by an equitable construction. This conclusion is easily illustrated. The Hancocks of Boston, again, providing a case study. Until 1737, Thomas Hancock seemingly had little to do with illicit trade. One of the major items in his business paper came from Holland, but the operation of the drawback system in England made it possible to obtain the Dutch paper through his agents in England for a reasonable price. At the time, English paper was neither so good nor so plentiful as that from Holland. Unfortunately, in 1737, the drawback on Dutch paper was stopped. Hancock soon engaged in a direct trade with Holland, while his orders for paper from London fell off correspondingly. Gunpowder was another important item in this trade, as Governor George Clinton of New York reported in 1752 that consumption of gunpowder was very great in the colony, where every man is in his daily use of firearms, and yet it will be found that the exportation of gunpowder from Great Britain cannot to any degree answer such an expense. The demand for this commodity in the plantations was greater than England could supply, with much of the gunpowder coming from Holland. In 1739, Archibald Kennedy, collector of New York, seized some casks of gunpowder which were discovered aboard a pilot boat off his port. It was proved in court that the powder had been brought from St. Eustatia in the ship Mary and Margaret and unladen from her between Sandy Hook and the Narrows and put on board the said pilot boat. The Mary and Margaret and the casks were tried in the Admiralty Court, but a common law prohibition nullified the whole legal action. 18 years later, gunpowder was one of the major items imported from Holland, which disturbed Governor Hardy so much, while in the tense months before the outbreak of the Revolution, this trade was to take on a desperate quality as the colonists prepared for the possibility of hostility. Along with ammunition, tea was a standard commodity in the illicit trade. Even O.M. Dickerson agrees that this item was worth the risk of smuggling, reporting that at no time prior to 1767 was a probable saving of British customs duties by smuggling less than a shilling per pound, and on several occasions it was at least 3 shillings per pound. The reason for this situation was that tea was used as a source of revenue by the English government. Certain drawbacks were allowed on exportation to the colonies, but the basic customs duties collected in England were not. Consequently, tea from England was generally more expensive than from elsewhere. It was included in the cargo of almost every ship seized or examined on suspicion of involvement in illegal trade. That tea should later play such an immediate role in the breakup of the empire seems only proper. Other items appear from time to time in this trade. Canvas, important to the shipbuilding industry, was listed regularly on the ship's cargoes and in the merchants' orders placed abroad. Coffee and cocoa brought about Thomas Hancock's first serious brush with the customs officers. Both cocoa and canvas figured in the orders Timothy Orrin gave to his captain in the West Indies. The other commodities Orrin suggested as possible purchases, cotton, cordage, anchors, and cable, appear occasionally. Much of the commerce must have centered on the luxury trade, including wines and French brandies. 1742, William Bolland of New York, or New England, wrote that from Holland his area was supplied with reels of yarn or spun hemp, paper, gunpowder, iron, and goods of various sorts used for men and women's clothing. To make his point more effectively, Bolland closed by saying, "I need only to acquaint you with that I write this clad in a superfine French cloth, which I bought on purpose that I might wear about the evidence of these illegal traders." In return, as well as molasses, rum, sugar, and rum, or European goods, bills of credit might be accepted. These, in turn, could be used to pay for goods purchased directly from Holland. A letter from Thomas Hancock to his agents, the Hopes of Amsterdam, illustrates yet another aspect of this direct trade. In 1742, Hancock wrote that he was sending a cargo of choice good New River chipped wood, which he expected to bring a better price than commonly wood is sold at. Also, he shipped 12 bags of cotton, which he had obtained at St. Eustatia, and 800 horns. One of his ships was to be sold in Holland as well. In exchange, he wanted various items, including a set of rigging for a brigantine or snow. Further, he asked the Hopes what sorts of flowered silks and damasks might be had with you. William Bolland's superfine French cloth may well have come over in one of Hancock's ships during this period. And this next section in recognizing the necessity of coupling any movement for reform with the creation of a general fund, Auchmuty was not alone. Many years earlier, Archibald Cummings had written at length on the subject, pointing out exactly how such fund could be raised. Some of these ideas have since penetrated to London itself. In 1744, the governor of New York reported that 2 documents published and circulated in England had been called to his attention, one of which concerned the means of advancing and protecting settlement in the colonies, while the other urged establishing by act of parliament stamp duties in all the colonies. With great insight, Clinton warned that the people in North America are quite strangers to any duty by such as they raise themselves, and was such a scheme to take place without their knowledge and might prove a dangerous consequence to His Majesty's interest. Nor was the pamphlet that so concerned Clinton the only writing on the subject. Many of Archibald Cummings' proposals were echoed in a document which suggested various ways to raise a fund for defense in the colonies. In fact, Henry McCullough, the probable author of this scheme, might well have been familiar with Cummings' plan. His 14-point program recommended a 6-pence tax on rum and other liquors distilled in the plantations, a 3-pence duty on molasses, a tax on slaves imported, an excise on liquor sold in America, a poll tax, and a stamp tax. With other duties, the author expected to plan to raise the improbable sum of £327,000. Another report, also probably from the pen of McCullough, urged that anyone assisting an illicit trader be severely punished, and anyone resisting a customs officer pay a £500 fine, and that all land be surveyed so that it might be properly taxed. And of course we have all of that. We have land surveyors for land tax purposes. We have, of course, excise on liquor and various other things. So it seems like they in fact have implemented those exact ideas. Chapter 8, Reform. Free ports, or 162. My note says free ports. So here we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of free port, not my word, by the way. Sant Eustatia, we have talked about that. A neutral island belonging to the Dutch at the beginning of the war, served as a center for trade between the colonists and the French. Under English law, provisions were considered contraband goods in wartime. To avoid the charge of dealing in contraband items, the Americans shipped their provisions to the Dutch island, where in turn the French gathered their molasses. Unfortunately for the Dutch, the English made an early effort to break this trade, arguing that in peacetime the French did not allow foreigners to trade with their islands. The British declared such trade between the Dutch and the French could not be permitted in time of war. Under the rule of 1756, the English government authorized seizure of Dutch ships engaged in this commerce, and the Navy was employed to make the order effective. As a result, the trade of Sant Eustatia was considerably reduced. As soon as that victory was achieved, the British were confronted with another problem. The Spanish also were at that point neutrals, and Monte Cristi on the island of Hispaniola was declared a free port by Spain. Between 1757 and 1760, the trade at Monte Cristi assumed fantastic proportions. It was estimated in 1760 that between 400 and 500 ships had taken on cargoes of French molasses there in 1 year. According to one British admiral, the newly established free port of Monte Cristi exists nowhere but in an airy regions of imagination, since there is here no city, no town, no port, but only a few huts. Eventually, after numerous legal difficulties, the rule of 1756 was extended to cover the Monte Cristi trade. By 1761, for a moment at least, that commerce too was greatly restricted by the activities of the British Navy. And now, an individual who I believe is overlooked, or at least not mentioned at all, like most of these individuals, for the impact that they made. In August 1760, Benjamin Barons arrived in Boston as the new collector. Earlier in his career as a London merchant, one of his own ships had been seized and condemned by the customs officers at Boston, which did not necessarily make for friendly relations between barons and the old customs officers. Now that is what I believe the real motivation for the arrival of this individual, rather than the motivation that they state. More important, Barons was out to make his fortune. That's the motivation they state. Previous collectors had done quite well, more through harmonious relations with the community of merchants than through the strict attention to duty. The Jekylls, for example, who had been collectors at Boston from 1707 to 1740, had become respected members of the community. When the older Jekyll died in 1733, the Boston Weekly Newsletter reported that by his courteous behavior to the merchant, he became the darling of all fair traders. With much humanity, he took pleasure in directing masters of vessels how they ought to avoid the breach of the acts of trade. Sir Charles Henry Franklin, successor to the Jekylls, had become a leader of Boston society, as has been said by a customs officer earlier. Such men were removed at a great distance from their superiors and often, continuing long in the same place, degenerate into Creoles and at length forget mother country and her interests. Benjamin Barons too sought to ingratiate himself with the local commercial aristocracy and made no effort to hide his plans. By the middle of October, Governor Bernard could report that the collector's intention of allying himself with the colonial faction which was opposed to effective enforcement of the acts of trade was common knowledge. Bernard tried unsuccessfully to reason with Barons. Calling in the Surveyor General and the Judge of the Admiralty Court was equally ineffectual. Barons thought he had discovered a way to assume the leadership of the commercial community, and he was not to be dissuaded. The weapons Barons employed was to expose to public view the practice of making secret payments to informers. There was a legal argument on his side by the Act of 6 George II. The King's 1/3 share of proceeds under the provisions of that Act were to go to the colony. Deducting the cost of the trials and the expenses of paying for informers had eaten into that share. Consequently, Barons charged Charles Paxton, the officer who had been responsible for most of the seizures, with defrauding the province of its rightful money. At his instigation, the accounting of the funds that should have accrued to the province. Meanwhile, Barons obtained some of the bills of cost issued by the court to pay informers and showed them about the town to inflame the citizens. Bernard himself was attacked for his opposition to Barons, the charge in his case being misconduct in the issuance of a register for a ship. A general meeting of the merchants was called and the bills of cost presented to the gathering. Barons wrote Bernard that if he did not approve the resolves issued by the meeting and also disavow Paxton and his party, his administration would be ruined. Barons' attitudes were made clear in the testimony of Ebenezer Richardson, whom Barons charged with being an informer for Paxton. Barons reportedly told Richardson that if he would work for him, he would pay more than Paxton. The collector added that although he had many proofs of illegal activities, he would not seize the offenders because he did not wish to distress the town and wanted to be free to call the people his friends. Barons was suspended from his office by the Surveyor General, Thomas Lechmere, who told the collector he had done so, 1, because Barons had tried to prevent execution of laws of trade, 2, because he had attempted to ruin the effectiveness of the Admiralty courts, 3, because he tried to intimidate the customs officer, and 4, because he had attacked the authority of the governor, 5, because he had been negligent in entering ships, and because he had attempted to rescue a ship seized by Paxton and publicly berated the sheriff who went to Paxton's aid. These seemed solid grounds for removal, but the Surveyor General wrote to the Commissioners of the Customs that he had not given the full articles of complaint to Barons. Instead, he gave him only general headings as above because Barons was an expert at making use of every scrap of paper to influence public opinion in his favor. Now that last comment right there, I believe, is the most important, and it tells you that this individual, Benjamin Barons, came onto the scene with a particular motive in mind, and it was not selfish or personal in nature. I would stipulate that his method or motive, well, not the motive, but rather his purpose, was to uncover the spy network. Before it becomes important for a time of war, those who are sellouts will become spies. And the main reason for that is because before war breaks out, the sellouts are only doing it for their own personal interest. They are selling out their neighbors, right? Well, in a time of war, now they can be blackmailed by that activity because if they're found out, they will be killed. So identifying the sellout network before they can become a spy network is extremely important. during overtures to war, of which in 1760 there most certainly were. Now, the interesting part about it was that I don't believe that Benjamin Barron's motivation necessarily was that a ship was seized, but that something else, which we're not being told, we are missing a portion of the story. Somebody does not ingratiate themselves and involve themselves with a specific type of strategic plan in mind unless there is a motivation beyond selfish purposes. So that's important to note here. Now, here's something interesting. Comptroller Ware was not alone in his concern about the future course of American growth and development. An expert analysis of the colonial problem, which was read and approved by Lord Bute and passed on to Grenville, was based on the proposition that His Majesty's possessions in North America are so many times more extensive than the island of Great Britain that if they were equally well inhabited, Great Britain could no longer maintain her dominion over them. It is therefore evidently her policy to set bounds to the increment of people and to the extent of the settlement in that country. The proclamation line of 1763 itself was based at least partially on the same proposition. As the Board of Trade later noted, the principle was adopted and approved and confirmed by His Majesty after the Treaty of Paris that the westward expansion of colonies should be confined to such a distance from the seacoast as that those settlements should lie within the reach of the trade and commerce of this kingdom, and also of the exercise of the authority and jurisdiction which was conceived to be so necessary for the preservation of the colonies in due subordination to and dependence upon the mother country. That's something I like to reiterate a lot, along with many of these other types of things. Now, something that also is interesting about this era is the term the Hovering Act, or hovering. It's similar to the use of our term loitering. The Hovering Act was merely a preliminary. On April 22nd, the Treasury considered the problem of financing the 10,000 troops Bute had authorized for the colonies. It was estimated that the total charge for this force would come to £224,903 a year. The colonies would have to contribute towards this expense. England's war debt stood at £137 million in January 1763. The interest on borrowed funds was nearly $5 million a year. The national yearly budget was only $8 million. On May 22nd, the Treasury asked the Customs Commissioners to consider the American revenue. On July 14th, the Treasury requested a list of all officers serving on the colonies. They revealed their urgency by ordering the commissioners to present their report by the next Friday. On the designated day, the commissioners presented to the Treasury a report far-reaching significance. In paragraph 9, the Hovering Act, 5 George I was extended to the colonies. Thereafter, any vessel below 50 tons was included in the provision authorizing the customs officers to inspect ships hovering off the coast of the colonies, seizing those which did not proceed on their voyage after being warned. So that's similar to the loitering stuff. They come out and warn you and say move along, and if you don't, then they seize you, basically. That's the idea. Paragraph 4 authorizes the king to divide proceeds from seizures as he saw fit in order to encourage the employment of ships of war and the prevention of smuggling. So that's interesting that a lot of the concepts here revolving around ships and trade and whatnot have thus been applied today to motor vehicles and pedestrian foot traffic and many other areas, right? Of course, I think it's interesting to note how many times they talk about the extensive rivers and inlets and creeks, and how much of our public waterways have been dammed up, made impassable, and how many restrictions there are on boating through those waters. Obviously, we are living in the aftermath of the people who lost the war for independence, reimposing things across the country, but with an eye towards their failures in the past. The Universal Government and Defense Fund, page 181. Actually, the passage of the Sugar Act in the next year was in the nature of an anticlimax. The most dangerous, but possibly the most essential feature of the program had been abandoned before the bill was presented to Parliament. Every suggestion in the past for raising the revenue in the colonies had been coupled with the idea of using such a fund to improve both the defense and the administration of those areas. Originally, this idea had been incorporated into the plan to increase colonial revenues as early as May 1763. The ministers had considered using the new income to finance both the military and the civil establishment in the plantations. In January 1764, estimates of all the colonial civil establishments were read at the Treasury. According to one report as late as February 11, 1764, Grenville still thought of using the new revenues to relieve colonial officials of dependence on the local assemblies. And according to the testimony of John Adams, this plan was not unknown to the colonists. Commenting on Oxenbridge Thatcher and his activities between 1763 and 1765, Adams later wrote that his favorite subject was politics and the impending threatening system of parliamentary taxation and universal government over the colonies. That we are dealing with today, this idea of the universal or global government. The new bill. Okay, so the Grenville Plan is really what lost the colonies to the empire. Because, and it's very simple, when you have a tense environment and you decide to implement a plan to make war on that tense environment, thus inflaming it more and making it worse, then you do what all of these others have done through their belligerent and crass natures and cause a unification of otherwise divided factions, or otherwise people who might have been on the fence but now have become certain that they must fight or else. This individual Grenville, not Lord North, was in fact the one who put forward one of the most aggressive and hostile strategies to be used against the colonies, thus uniting the various factions that were competing in the country. The new bill was introduced in the House of Commons on March 9, 1764. Horace Walpole recorded that Grenville answered questions with more art than sincerity, but there was little debate. There were a few more speeches, but no division, and that alone is strange. The second and third readings on the 2nd of March and the 5th of April encountered little opposition. Like I said, it's weird. There's always opposition. There's always somebody that pops up, and they don't even have to be opposed to the idea. They're just opposed politically or some other reason. To have no dissension whatsoever is unheard of. Sent to the House of Lords, the Sugar Act became law with no further questions. The House of Lords did not concern itself actively with money bills. The purpose of this act for granting certain revenues in the British colonies, as set forth in the rest of the lengthy title, was to continue the Molasses Act, which was about to expire, to employ the new revenue to provide for the defense of the colonies, to explain certain provisions of the Act of 1763, to alter various drawbacks and exports from Great Britain, to prevent smuggling and to secure the trade between the motherland and the colonies. Its provisions were to take effect as of September 29, 1764. Paragraphs 3 and 4 dealt with the molasses duty, although the Act of 6 George II hath been found in some degree useful, yet it is highly expedient that the same should be altered, enforced, and made more effectual. The Molasses Act was continued, but after September 29th, the duty would be 3 pence instead of 6. Paragraph 10 placed the new funds raised by the lower duty and imposts on wines and other items at the disposal of Parliament to be used for the defense and security of the colonies. The provisions immediately related to the Customs Service began with paragraph 18, which totally prohibited the importation of foreign-produced rum and spirits into the plantations. Section 20 incorporated one of the suggestions of the commissioners by requiring all masters carrying foreign sugars or molasses to have with them at all times a certificate that bond had been given to take the goods only to Great Britain or another English colony. Paragraph 21 ordered that such certificates should be turned in by the captain at the port of arrival. And there you get the origin of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau. But you also get an interesting prelude to the Prohibition era in the 1930s. In 183, we have additions to the enumerated list. The other provisions to ensure enforcement can briefly be summarized. Ships found with enumerated goods within 2 leagues of the shore, not producing certificates covering the same, were liable to seizure. Coffee, pimentos, coconuts, whale fins, raw silk and hides, and skins were placed on the enumerated list. No wood included in the definition of naval stores, as set out in the Act of 8 George I, should be loaded until a bond had been given to carry it to Great Britain. To prevent the use of coasting vessels and smuggling, no goods were to be loaded on any ship to be carried from one colony to another until a permit for loading had been given to the customs officers. Cockets were required to show the contents of all vessels employed in such intercolonial trade, whether or not the cargoes included enumerated or dutiable commodities. And here is the big part. The Sugar Act, as passed by Parliament, left many problems unsolved, particularly in its failure to relieve the colonial officials of their financial dependence on the colonists. But it was a beginning. Some of the more obvious loopholes in the machinery intended to enforce the commercial regulations had been corrected. Improved enforcement would mean increased revenues, and properly employed, the augmented revenues could in turn be used to strengthen the whole imperial structure. While it had been necessary to abandon for the time the idea of independent salaries for the major colonial officials because of the expense of the military establishment, still even the presence of the troops might have a salutary effect. When the question of troops for America was first discussed, the Board of Trade suggested that one of the prime considerations was the stationing of troops in order to awe the British colonies, while another proposal noted that the provinces being now surrounded by an army and navy and by hostile tribes of Indians, it may be time to exact a due obedience to the just and equitable regulations of a British Parliament. Yet another suggestion recommended that forts be erected to the entrance to all principal harbors in the colonies, and so situated as to protect and at the same time command the towns, which would better serve to secure the dependence of the colonies. More practically, the Treasury itself noted that the troops could be used in the ports, which caused the most difficulty in order to increase the authority of the customs officers. Given the seriousness of the problem simply was whether such a low, step-by-step approach as that undertaken by Grenville was practical, given the well-documented record of colonial opposition. Because, of course, the issue touched upon went far deeper than a mere increase in taxes for the colonists, as Grenville himself later noted, the right of taxation and the question of sovereignty have ever been and must be inseparable. And the point was clearly understood by at least some in the colonies. In the first major reply to the actions of the British government, James Otis, after disposing of nonsensical, as he saw it, distinction between internal and external taxation, observed that if taxes are imposed on any people without consent, they cannot be said to be free. This barrier of liberty being once broken down, all is lost. Given the seriousness of the issue and the long heritage of neglect and nonconformance, or enforcement of British authority within the colonies, perhaps the piecemeal approach adopted by Grenville seemed wise, but there was a danger involved. To alert the colonial opposition without the same time strengthening the imperial machinery to the point at which it can enforce the government's program in spite of resistance in the colonies might be to court disaster. The Sugar Act, coupled with the simultaneous discussion of extension of the Stamp Act, revealed English intentions. The test would come when the nature and the extent of colonial opposition became known. Chapter 9, A Time of Troubles. At the same time these changes were initiated in the Customs Service, a move to improve the effectiveness of the Admiralty jurisdiction in America was made. The individual colonial Admiralty courts were left untouched, but a new court with jurisdiction over all the colonies was established at Halifax in Nova Scotia. Thereafter, any offense against the Navigation Acts could be taken to that court instead of to the local tribunal at the discretion of the prosecuting officer. The obvious intention was to provide a court removed from local involvements where the royal officials could expect to find a more impartial settlement of their cases. Selected to preside over the new tribunal was William Spry, related by marriage to William Pitt. If the English effort to enforce a coherent and orderly colonial system found the Customs Service ill-prepared and suffering from the years of neglect, the colonial opposition exhibited no such weaknesses. Part of the new program involved the station of naval cutters off of the coast of America to guard against clandestine landings in the numerous rivers and bays. Lieutenant Thomas Hill was in charge of the first such ship to cruise off Rhode Island. Acting on his new authority as a commissioned officer of the customs, Hill attempted to inspect and seize a vessel in the waters of the colony. He was received in what the Admiralty termed a riotous manner by the inhabitants, who forced the gunners of the harbor fort to fire on the royal ship. In spite of Treasury orders that the affair should be thoroughly investigated, and anyone who engaged in an act so highly criminal as resisting all legal authority and actually firing the guns of His Majesty's ports against ships of war should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, no further action was taken. The united front presented by the colonists made investigation difficult, and more important, problems soon intervened. Elsewhere, the story was much the same. In New York, the commander of the royal cutter was jailed after Admiralty Court had ruled against the seizure he had made. Although the captain had made the seizure on the advice of the Attorney General, the customs officers, too, felt the effect of the increased opposition the new regulations aroused. The collector at Pocomoke, Maryland, reported in 1765 that he had been brutally assaulted in the execution of his duty. A forcible rescue was made of his seizure at Newburyport in Massachusetts early in 1766. A similar occurrence took place at Falmouth in Maine in the same year. The most publicized outbreak took place in Massachusetts in May 1764. John Robinson became collector at the customs in Rhode Island. From the beginning, his experiences were unfortunate. The governor had refused to swear him into office, and within a short time of his arrival, a vessel seized on the order of the Surveyor General was rescued by a mob of disguised citizens. In April of the next year, a ship named the Polly entered at Newport from Suriname. Her cargo was entered at the customs house, and the vessel proceeded elsewhere to unload her molasses. Robinson, meanwhile, became suspicious of the small size of the entered cargo and determined that the Polly should be thoroughly examined. He overtook the ship at Dighton in Massachusetts on the 6th of April, 1765. 4 days after the original entry had been made, on board he found nearly double the reported amount of molasses. Robinson, of course, seized the Polly, but could not find enough men at Dighton to sail her back to Newport for trial. Leaving 2 of his men in charge of the ship, the collector returned to Rhode Island to find a crew. In his absence, a mob boarded the ship, stripped her of her cargo and all her furnishings, allowing the Polly to run ashore. Robinson hurried back to Dighton with a large party of armed Marines and sailors, only to find that a warrant had been issued for his arrest on a charge brought against him by the captain of the Polly. Eager to give the colonists no cause to complain that he had ignored the law, the collector submitted to arrest and was taken to Taunton, where he was jailed. $195. When the Rhode Island collector seized the Polly and was imprisoned in the Taunton jail, he notified Temple of his plight. The Surveyor General provided bail for him and obtained his release. But Temple was not satisfied to wait for the slow workings of the law to correct the injustice done to a customs officer. He wanted immediate support furnished to Robinson, even if it meant calling up the militia to teach the inhabitants a lesson. Bernard was not eager to aid the Surveyor General and did not wish to risk doing irreparable harm to the royal government by hasty and extreme action. As a result, little was done to help Robinson, who did, however, manage to get the Polly afloat again and secure her condemnation in the newly established Admiralty Court at Halifax. Bernard was annoyed at this insult to the objectivity of the Admiralty Court in New England and felt that an unnecessary slight had been cast on the judge in the court there, as well as on the other officials who were trying to create support for the government. Temple in turn accused the governor of being concerned only because he lost his share in the proceeds of the condemnation of the Polly, although no one profited very much from the disposal of the stripped and damaged ship. The first royal captain to make a seizure in the waters of Massachusetts found his prize taken from him by the customs officers. He had seized a cargo of molasses only to have a customs officer board the ship and seize the cargo again. The captain protested this intrusion on his rights, but was soothed with the promise that he would be awarded 1/3 of the proceeds anyway. Then, to his chagrin, he discovered that the Surveyor General took an active interest in the affair and decided not to prosecute at all. Not only did the captain lose his profits, but in the process, a clear violation of the Acts of Trade was allowed to pass unpunished. In New York, another captain received so little cooperation from the customs staff and the legal authorities that only was a seizure he had made released by the Admiralty Court, but no steps were taken to protect him from being prosecuted in revenge by the owner, with the result that the captain of the royal cutter passed some time in jail until his release was ordered from England. Such feuds continued up to the eve of the Revolution itself. As late as 1773, Admiral John Montagu complained that his naval captains received no support from either the customs officers or the civil authorities. At one point, in disgust at the whole enterprise, the Admiralty suggested that if the Navy was to bear the expense and the Customs Service receive the profits, in all fairness, the cost of maintaining the various sloops and cutters should be assigned to the Customs Commissioners. Now, here's an interesting thing to mention. The Stamp Act. News of the passage of the Stamp Act was at first greeted with an outburst of angry oratory. Patrick Henry rose to immediate intercolonial fame on the news of the stand he had taken in the Virginia House of Burgesses in support of the resolutions condemning the action of Parliament. At the suggestion of the Massachusetts Assembly, an intercolonial meeting was summoned, the famous Stamp Act Congress. From this assembly came resolutions denying the right of Parliament to impose internal taxes in the colonies and requesting immediate repeal. Interestingly, 2 of the 13 resolutions concerned the previous acts of Parliament as well as the Stamp Act. Article 9 complained that the duties imposed by several late acts of Parliament were extremely burdensome and grievous, and the collection of them absolutely impracticable, because of the shortage of specie. The 11th article stated that the restrictions imposed by several late acts of Parliament on the trade of these colonies will render them unable to purchase the manufactures of Great Britain. There was some thought given at the Congress to demanding the repeal of all the acts of trade as well as the Stamp Act, but the majority settled for an express denial of Parliament's right to impose internal taxes, with no direct statement regarding its right to regulate trade through the collection of duties. By autumn of 1765, it was clear that the colonists intended to make a determined stand against the Stamp Act. When the names of those appointed to collect the new taxes became known, they were burned in effigy, some forced to resign their commissions, while homes and property of others were damaged by rioters. There was no doubt as to what the colonists would do when the stamps first arrived, but there was a question as to what the various royal officers would do. The first cargo of stamps arrived in Boston in September. Governor Bernard clearly indicated the problem created for the colonial authorities by the unwise haste of the English ministry in enacting this measure. To send hither ordinances for execution, which the people have publicly protested against as illegal and not binding on them, without first providing the power to enforce obedience, is tempting them to revolt. In the difficult situation, the royal officials performed as might have been expected. Each refused to take responsibility for what happened and executed his concession to the popular furor on the grounds of lack of support from other authorities. With the stamp collector forced to resign his office by the mob, Governor Bernard used the excuse that he was not authorized to distribute the stamps to have them stored in safety in the fort in Boston Harbor. His denial of responsibility left the other authorities unsure as to how to conduct their affairs. Should they carry on as usual without using stamp paper, or should they refuse to permit any transactions at all? Bernard hoped that if all the ports were closed, and the courts as well, the anarchy and economic pressure would force the colonists to accept the act. The only difficulty was that, lacking the strong support that should have been provided from home, no official was willing to make such an all-out stand at the risk of his life, property, and position. The English ministry had ignited a conflagration at a time when the colonial administrative authorities were ill-equipped to uphold the imperial policies. And now we get into some of the really interesting events. When in Rhode Island, the successful opposition to the Stamp Act emboldened the colonists to harass the customs officers with legal prosecutions, the result in Massachusetts was more dramatic. The Sugar Act had imposed a duty on Madeira wines, a favorite drink of the colonists. In September 1766, the customs officers in Boston received secret information that Daniel Malcolm, a strenuous opponent of the trade laws, had several casks of wine on which he paid no duty hidden in his house. The officers went to investigate Malcolm, and Malcolm permitted them to see every room in his house but one, which he claimed was rented by another man and was not his to show. After several hours of argument, the customs officers withdrew and secured a writ of assistance. They returned with the sheriff, but this time Malcolm shut himself in the house and refused to communicate with the officers. A crowd gathered. The sheriff was told that if any attempt was made against the house, hundreds more would be summoned by the ringing of the bell in the North Church. Thus intimidated, the customs officers withdrew, deeply conscious of their public humiliation. It might seem odd that this seemingly minor affair should have achieved such quick fame, but the colonists appreciated Malcolm's open defiance of the hated officers, particularly because it involved the infamous writs of assistance which Otis had attacked so eloquently years before. On the other side, the customs officers were determined to make an example of Malcolm. In their view, he was clearly guilty of contempt of the law. They appealed to England for support, which they found the commissioners of the customs and the treasury ready to supply. Once again, the peculiarities of the legal status of the Acts of Trade brought their hopes to defeat. As penal statutes, the acts had to be interpreted literally. Although writs of assistance had been granted by the colonial courts for years, and despite the fact that some 4 years earlier the governor and his supporters had successfully combated a complaint by the colonial opposition that the writs were illegal, now careful legal examination in London proclaimed that the colonists had been right and the royal officials wrong. The Attorney and Solicitor Generals of England declared the writs of assistance were not valid in America. Their argument was exactly that used earlier by Otis. The Acts of Parliament only provided that such writs could be issued by the Court of the Exchequer. There were no exchequer courts in the colonies, consequently no legal writs could be issued there. They advised the Treasury that no action could be taken against Malcolm, inasmuch as the writs of assistance by virtue of which they entered the house and cellar was not in the case a legal authority. The Treasury was properly horrified by this ruling. They required their own solicitor to resubmit the question to the Attorney General, pointing out that writs had been used in the colonies in the past, and particularly that an act of the Massachusetts legislature itself, made in 1700, established a superior court, stated that such a court should have all the powers lodged in the courts of the King's Bench, Common Pleas, and Exchequer within England. This act, the Treasury Lords thought, had been made in connection with the Act of 1696, and clearly created an Exchequer court in the Bay Colony. The legal authorities refused, however, to revise their opinion, which was based on the wordings of the Acts of Parliament themselves. Consequently, any thought of making an example of Malcolm had to be abandoned. The publicity given to the incident backfired. Malcolm became a hero, and instead of proving the folly of opposing the enforcement of the laws, his case became one more well-known defeat for the cause of English supremacy. Now we're going to talk about somebody named Henry Laurens, and why this idea of being so belligerent always backfires. When the English had achieved in these years not the fulfillment of their imperial dreams, rather they had given unity and direction to the colonial opposition before England itself was ready or able to enforce its decisions, a man such as Henry Laurens was not a born rebel. He was a conservative merchant alienated by what he felt to be an arbitrary and unwarranted intrusion on his commercial practices and interests. In effect, he refused to be exploited for the benefit of the mother country. Arguments as to the right of Parliament to levy internal taxes, as opposed to its right to regulate trade, in his case, were without meaning. No question of taxation was involved in his dispute with the customs officers. Laurens' annoyance centered on the attempt to control his coastal trade with the neighboring colony of Georgia. For years he had been free to send his ships on such trips as he wished. Now, because the English felt with some justice that the intercolonial trade was used to defeat some of the provisions of the trade laws, Laurens was to be forced to obey new and onerous regulations that added to his expenditures both in time and money. Laurens refused to conform to the new regulations. In his view, he was an equal of the merchant in England, and his welfare should be as much the concern of the English government as was that of their own men of business. When his interests were ignored, he felt it necessary to protest. With no constitutional method available to carry his objections to England, he acted in the logical manner. He used the belligerent atmosphere of his native colony to make good his complaints. In doing so, he coupled himself, his influence and prestige irrevocably with the colonial cause. Fittingly, Laurens was destined to become president of the Continental Congress and to preside over the dissolution of the ties that bound the colonies to the British Empire. And so, in essence, it was not a term of appeasement which led to the loss of the colonies and the inevitable war, but rather the belligerent actions which made it inevitable. Next, we will be reading from chapter 10, Fulfillment, 214 to 215. So here we get a quote from Townshend. Here lay the heart of the Townshend program. The proposal for a colonial civil list, which had been discarded by Grenfell for one of sufficient funds, was to be Townshend's First concern. The bill introduced belatedly by Townsend on May 13th contained this preamble. Whereas it is expedient that a revenue should be raised in your Majesty's Dominions America for making certain and adequate provisions for defraying the charge of the administration of justice and the support of civil government in such provinces where it should be found necessary, and towards further defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the said dominions, we grant unto your majesty the several rates and duties hereinafter mentioned. So obviously they're imposing taxes by another means, but more importantly, what he just described there is exactly what is going on today. It's what we have. We do not have the U.S. constitutional government. What we have is this. The continuation of the same empire that was defeated in 1776. And now we get on to the idea of it being done in the Americas by Americans, basically. By this time, the Treasury had become intrigued with the thought of the establishment of an American board and asked the commissioners to offer more explicit proposals separately from the question of payments to the military forces in the colony. By July 1767, the commissioners had prepared a detailed plan for the new board and attended the Treasury Lords in person to present their suggestions. They proposed a board consisting of 5 members, each receiving a salary of £500 per year. They would be provided with 4 clerks, the chief clerk, who would also act as registrar of seizures, receiving £100, the second clerk £60, and the 2 others £40 each a year. Further, the board would have a solicitor, £200, who would have clerical help of his own amounting to £160 a year. Other officers included a cashier and paymaster, a comptroller to check the accounts of the cashier, an inspector of imports and exports, and 2 roving inspector generals, to be used as the board saw fit. The total yearly salary bill for this proposed establishment amounted to £4,500. And that would be probably per year. The location of the new board was considered at length, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston all being discussed. Unfortunately, the reason for the choice of Boston is not recorded. There are many possible explanations. Boston was the most active of the centers of opposition to the English administration. Stationing the commissioners there would lend their authority and prestige to the work of the local customs officers. Perhaps Boston was selected because it was nearest of the major ports to Halifax, where the headquarters of the British Navy in America was located. The Treasury Lords may have recognized the importance of coordinating the activities of the Customs Service and the Navy, or possibly the board was set up at Boston merely because it was the nearest of all the 3 major ports to England. The American commissioners, like their counterparts in England, were to be under the supervision of the Treasury, and communication between the 2 departments would need to be as swift as possible to ensure complete efficiency. So the next part, page 225 to 226. Most suggestions for setting up a Central Bureau of American Affairs had envisaged transforming the Board of Trade into a Department of State. Halifax in 1751 and later had tried to do just that, but had been frustrated by his inability to secure cabinet rank. When the Rockingham Ministry took up the problem, they at first intended to merge the Board of Trade into the new American department, but the king disapproved of this plan. As a result, when the new office was set up in January 1768, it was separate and distinct from the board. Although Hillsborough eventually did combine in his person 2 offices of American Secretary and President of the Board of Trade, unfortunately, while the establishment of the new office was an improvement from an administrative point of view, the selection of Hillsborough for the position was unwise. Hillsborough, along with other members of the Bedford faction, was dedicated to ruling America with an iron hand. His appointment and his behavior, once he was in office, were partly responsible for Newcastle's comment that the doctrine of doing everything by force prevails now everywhere. More important, perhaps, than his addiction to the doctrine of force, which, after all, he shared with many others at the time, was the fact that Hillsborough was easily panicked and given to hasty decisions. In the long run, he was to contribute markedly to the growth of colonial opposition to English policies. With Hillsborough's appointment, the major components of Townshend's system were assembled. The key to his program lay in the use to be made of the revenues arising in America. In effect, what he proposed to do was to raise funds in America to relieve the royal officials there of any dependence on the inhabitants. A remodeling of colonial government was Townshend's aim, to which the raising of a revenue by act of the British Parliament became a necessary corollary. 100 years earlier, the Stuarts had thought to achieve the same, and merely by asserting their authority in America. The Dominion of New England had represented the execution of that policy in practice. Now, a century later, merely to assert the authority of England was not enough. Grenville had tried to do just that with disastrous results. Townshend's approach was more subtle, realizing that nothing could be accomplished until and unless English political authority within the colonies was strengthened. Townshend intended to use money taken from the colonists themselves to finance a gradual revival of imperial power. Officials and adherents of royal government would be financed and lavishly rewarded from the American revenues. At the same time, the collection and enforcement machinery, as well as the whole administrative apparatus would be tightened, and as royal government became more effective, the available revenues in turn would be increased. In effect, taking advantage of increasing resentment among Englishmen at the conduct of the colonists and of equally widespread desire for tax reduction, Townshend introduced a program which was intended to correct the one fatal flaw of the previous colonial system. If effective, it would ensure the combination of absolute legislative authority with the power of the purse. Hopefully, the result would be the realization at last of the conception of the empire as a network of interrelated parts, all dedicated and devoted to one primary purpose, the sustenance of the welfare and prosperity of England. And of course, that's exactly what we have now. We have extorted funds via licenses, speeding tickets, and various other fees and things like that, in order to fund our own inimical occupation and otherwise empirical structure based off of foreign interests. Now we get into the last part of our review of this book, which is Chapter 11, Collapse. 228 and 229, we come back to the mention of a Daniel Malcolm. In March 1768, open opposition to the board first appeared as reported by Bernard. Daniel Malcolm, a little trader. They always love to use that little contemptuous diminution in their adverbs or adjectives. Well, trader is a verb, but in this case it's a noun. So, who had made a reputation for himself earlier by his resistance to the customs officers, expecting the arrival of a vessel from the Madeiras, approached the customs officers and asked what indulgence he might expect in regard to the duties. Told none at all, Malcolm replied that he was pleased to know exactly how matters now stood. When the ship arrived, he had it anchor below the town and loaded a reported total of 60 pipes of wine, which were then smuggled into Boston and hidden in various cellars. The next day, Malcolm's captain went to the customs house and entered as having come in ballast from Suriname. Since no one could be found to inform on Malcolm, he suffered not at all. In fact, 3 days after his successful coup, Malcolm presided over a general meeting of the merchants of Boston called to discuss opposition to the new British measures. As Bernard pointed out, this meeting was in a sense the first extra-legal assembly to be called in Boston in protest against the acts of Parliament. Previous discussions have been carried on in the regular town meetings. On April 7, 1768, one of Hancock's ships, the Lydia, arrived in Boston. 2 tradesmen were put on board by the collector. While they were there, Hancock and a crowd of followers, including Malcolm, boarded the ship. According to the laws, customs officers were permitted to board a vessel either to search for illegal goods or to see that no goods were unloaded without the knowledge of the authorities. In the former case, they were free to inspect the entire ship, but if their orders were merely to watch for attempts to smuggle goods ashore, the law specified only that they might remain on board. Hancock orders his captain not to let the tradesmen below deck on pain of dismissal. However, the following night, one of the officers, thinking he was unobserved, went below to look the cargo over. Hancock was summoned and confronted the tidesmen. Surrounded by 8 or so followers, including once again the ever-present Malcolm, intimidated by the show of force, the tidesman stated that he had no orders to search the boat. Thereupon Hancock had him forcibly carried on deck, while the companionway was fastened shut behind him. Malcolm, meanwhile, shouted, "Damn him and hand him up. If it was my vessel, I would knock him down." Again, as in the earlier incident involving Malcolm Seller, this minor affair was blown into a major incident. In the tense, expectant atmosphere of Boston in that year, very little was required to ignite an explosion. While the case of Lydia was still being discussed, another of Hancock's ships, the Liberty, arriving in Boston, coming from the Madeiras with a cargo of wine. The captain entered 25 pipes of wine at the customs house. It was reported that much more wine was actually on board, but the 2 tidesmen stationed on the Liberty stated that nothing more than the reported cargo was discharged from the vessel. However, the commissioners, remembering that Hancock had given out in public that we the commissioners are not recalled, he will get rid of us before Christmas, were not convinced that all was well with the Liberty. The outdoor officers were one of the weak links in the operation of the customs service. They were exposed to danger. They were also the most open to bribery. In fact, there were few, if any, checks on their activities, except that they usually worked in pairs. Generally, it was reported that either intimidation or bribery was frequently effective in inducing them to ignore their duty. Only 2 months before the arrival of the Liberty, the commissioners themselves had informed the Treasury that they had discovered that the local outdoor officers were guilty of collusive practices. As a corrective, the commissioners had appointed more tidesmen, but all that had been accomplished was to further irritate the merchants. Similarly, a few years later, the collector at Philadelphia reported with disgust that one of the tidesmen in his port, 2 were under investigation, and 3 were under suspicion for complicity in various illegal entries. Now, in the case of the Liberty, a strange tale unfolded. A month after the arrival and unloading of the Liberty, one of the tidesmen, Thomas Kirk, went to the collector and comptroller and told them of the following story. On the night the Liberty had docked in Boston, he and his fellow tidesmen had been put on board. The other officers soon had too much to drink and staggered off home. One of Hancock's captains later came on board and suggested to Kirk that he should permit the wine to be unloaded. According to Kirk, he refused that suggestion and was thereupon forced below deck and locked there for 3 hours. During that period, he heard men at work moving the cargo about and possibly unloading some. When he was finally released, Hancock's captain threatened that if one word of the affair was reported to the authorities, Kirk's property and indeed his life would be endangered. Kirk kept his silence for a month, but during that period, the captain who threatened him died. The tidesman then felt free to carry his story to the superiors, or so he reported. The truth behind this story told by Kirk will never be known. It is possible that he was lying, either at the request of the collector and comptroller who wished to revenge themselves on Hancock, or for reasons of his own. Perhaps Kirk had permitted the wine to be unloaded, accepted a bribe for doing so, and then, after the captain died, thought he could make more by informing on his superiors. Or perhaps Kirk was telling simply the truth. Hancock had previously shown that he knew how to use intimidation effectively, and Kirk may have really been frightened into silence. William Baxter, who has made an exhaustive study of Hancock's papers, reported that he could find nothing to either prove or disprove Hancock's statement that there were only 25 pipes of wine on board the Liberty. Considering Hancock's earlier public defiance of the customs officers, as well as the activities of Malcolm, any collector had good reason to suspect that Kirk's story was true. At any rate, it seemed a good opportunity to make an example of the infatuated merchant. Next, we're going to talk about Temple. The popular clamor against 4 of the commissioners and not the 5th is easily accounted for. It was said the commissioners would cause new changes and new and heavy burdens upon trade. The people wished therefore that the Surveyor General might not be superseded. The commissioners exerted themselves to restore the acts of trade, which for 2 or 3 years together no officer dared to carry into execution. Penal laws which had been disused from the opposition made by the people are considered as more grievous when revived than when first enacted. The people therefore have always wished to see the board abolished and the Surveyor General restored. Temple was not bothered by the harassment his colleagues experienced. While they took shelter in the harbor fort, he continued to live in Boston and come and go as he pleased. This was true both in 1768 after the seizure of the Liberty and again in 1770 when the commissioners once more retreated from Boston in the aftermath of the massacre. Temple continued to complain that he was not permitted to see any documents that the others never consulted him on important matters, and the generally was ignored. In turn, the other commissioners felt Temple was not to be trusted with any information, as he was quite likely to pass anything he learned on to his colonial friends. The reluctance of the commissioners on this point echoed by Thomas Hutchinson. When Hutchinson had some confidential news for the members of the board, he stipulated that it be kept from the knowledge of the fifth. So that's Temple. Obviously, he had some measure of intelligence and ingratiated himself with the merchant class of the time period. This also is where the idea of the quorum comes from. The four commissioners answered that Fisher's explanation was not only inadequate but insulting. They suspended him, but Temple refused to sign the order with them. To the Treasury, the four commissioners wrote that they had suspended Fisher for misconduct and for expressing himself in a way no board could countenance and still maintain its authority. They asked the Treasury to uphold their decision and at the same time requested permission for the board to carry on its affairs even if one of the members would not participate or sign their orders. In their answer, the Treasury Lords refused to take sides in the dispute, which they correctly attributed to the feud between the majority of the board and Temple. Commending both the zeal and attention to duty displayed by the American commissioners, the Treasury said that while there seemed to have been reasonable grounds for inquiring into Fisher's conduct, the evidence offered to prove his misconduct was not sufficient. Reminding the commissioners of their previous advice to act with firmness, but so as not to give offense, the Treasury Lords added that they were unwilling for many reasons to order the suspension of Mr. Fisher to be taken off by an immediate interposition of their own authority, but they desire and direct you to cause this act to be done by an order of your own hand, or your own board. Aside from the face saving permission to reinstate Fisher on their own order, the four commissioners' only consolation in this affair was the Treasury's confirmation of the request to carry on their business even if one of the members would not participate. Thereafter, any three of the commissioners could act in the name of the whole board. And that is exactly how our commissions are set up today. And that is where the idea of the quorum comes from. It is not part of the U.S. Constitution, however. And now here's a brief explanation of the status of smuggling throughout the realm. But other than this partial success in the area of the revenue, the American commissioners and the Customs Service generally gave a poor account of themselves. In 1769-70, a comprehensive survey was made of the American customs operation. No better commentary could exist on the failure of these years, indeed in the failure of 100-year history of the Customs Service, than the results shown in this survey. Even the boundaries of some of the legal ports were not known with precision. It has been taken for granted that the limits of this port, Philadelphia, begins where a line divides Pennsylvania from Newcastle country. The boundaries of this port, Roanoke, Virginia, never settled. How the boundaries of this district, York River, Virginia, were originally settled, not able to say, but from long usage. In some places, the collectors had little to do with the transactions. The collector, South Potomac, Virginia, resides up the river, carries on the business by deputy. Smugglers operated freely in each and every port and colony. Many vessels which trade to the foreign islands neither enter nor clear any customs house, Falmouth, Maine. Smuggling in this district, Rhode Island, is carried on to a very great degree. Large quantities of tea, etc., brought in small boats, Perth, Amboy, New Jersey. Much smuggling from Holland, France, and the West Indies, and publicly advertised the goods of the manufacturers of those countries to be sold. Charleston, South Carolina. In some places, the problem was geographical. The harbors, rivers, and creeks along this coast, New Haven, Connecticut, are many and commodious for smuggling. In others, legal loopholes served to mask the smuggling trade. The officers much distressed for a rule of conduct respecting the coastal trade, South Carolina. Generally, there was a shortage of customs personnel to do an effective job. In spite of the growth of the Boston district, there were still no regular customs officers. But at the port of entry, except at Plymouth and Nantucket, at all the others, vessels load and unload without the inspection of any officer. Similar complaints had been made 100 years earlier by the first customs official sent to America, and the suggestions for improvement offered in this report were familiar too. An increase in the water guard, in particular in the size of the customs staff generally. Seemingly, 100 years of development had left the Customs Service close to its starting point. Open opposition to the Townshend Acts had been slow in appearing. Many colonists hesitated to repeat the excesses associated with the Stamp Act riots and hoped that in time the English ministry could be convinced of its mistake in a more orderly manner. Aware of the general reluctance to resort to extreme measures, Sam Adams and his associates moved with caution. A carefully worded circular letter was sent by the Massachusetts House of Representatives to the assemblies of the other colonies. With becoming restraint, the letter protested the loyalty of the authors to the king, stressed the impracticability of arranging for the Americans to be represented in Parliament, and emphasized that consequently the independence of the various colonial assemblies was their only guarantee of freedom. The Massachusetts leaders hoped by means of this letter to stimulate a joint response by the colonies to the English measures, but at first the reaction was disappointing. Pennsylvania, for example, under the influence of Joseph Galloway, declined to consider the letter, which was fit only for the selectmen of Boston and the mob meetings of Rhode Island. At that moment, Hillsborough chose to send his own circular letter to the governors of each colony, ordering the governors to see earlier that the Massachusetts letter was condemned by their legislatures, or that the legislature should be dissolved if they declined to do so. Hillsborough, in effect, gave substance to the fears expressed in the communication the Bay Colony had sent out. It was Hillsborough's letter, not that from Massachusetts, that was condemned in colony after colony as a tyrannical encroachment on their legislative freedom, and the colonial opposition took on new strength and solidarity. Eventually, the colonists united in agreement to use commercial pressure to bring the English government to its senses, and non-important agreements generally went into effect in the various ports and commercial centers of America. In November 1770, John Hatton, the collector at Salem and Cohensey in New Jersey, attempted to seize a coasting craft which was unloading goods from ships anchored in the bay between the colony and Pennsylvania. Not only was he forced to surrender his prize to determined rescuers, but in revenge he was prosecuted on a charge of having wounded one of the sailors in the boat he seized and required to spend some time in the local jail. While his quarry escaped and carried the boat and its cargo off to Philadelphia, still determined, Hatton has sent his son to Philadelphia to warn the collector there to watch for the arrival of the rescued boat. Inspecting the harbor, his son found the boat already arrived. Realizing that they were discovered, the crew of the boat organized an attack on young Hatton, who was dragged from place to place, beaten savagely, tarred and feathered, and even had hot tar poured into open wounds he had previously received in helping to make the original seizure. In the words of the Philadelphia collector, young Hatton was tortured in the manner above related an hour or more. During that time, no public official came to his aid, nor any private person for that matter. As a result of this ordeal, young Hatton lay for a time near death, and when he did recover, had lost the use of his right arm. From this whole affair, Hatton received little satisfaction. The authorities in New Jersey disclaimed any responsibility, since the seizure had been made in the bay and not within their jurisdiction. At the same time, however, Hatton was prosecuted by the common law courts for attacking and wounding a sailor during the affray. By 1773, the East India Company was in financial distress. Imports from India rotted in its warehouses, while its stocks dropped continually in value. New markets were needed, and quickly, or the company, the £400,000 a year which the government received from it, as well as the British possessions in India, would be endangered. North's solution was to rescue the company by providing it with new markets in America. When the company directors suggested to him that the tax on tea imported into America should be repealed, the Prime Minister declined to take that step. Instead, he allowed the company to export its tea directly to America without being required as formally to auction it off to English middlemen, who in turn sent it to the colonies. At the same time, the government surrendered for the moment the £400,000 a yearly payment the company had made, and also gave the company an emergency loan of £1,400,000. North clung to the tea duty in the colonies not only because he made it a symbol of parliamentary supremacy, but also because he was intrigued by the thought of the potential increase in the revenues available to the English government in America. If the East India Company will export tea to America, they will very much increase that duty and consequently very much facilitate the carrying of government in that part. In fact, North's plan was subtly designed to promote the consumption of tea in America to the benefit both of the company and of the royal revenues. But North overestimated the naivete of the colonists. Not only was the duty on tea the one remaining tax left from the hated Townsend program, but the entrance of the East India Company into the local markets upset the established patterns of the tea trade, alienating elements of the commercial classes in all the colonial ports. Not the least affected were those who had profited from the smuggling of tea, long a traditional pastime for Americans. The destruction of the tea sent to America, highlighted by the party at Boston, brought a sudden end to the period of watchful waiting. Even had he wished, North could not overlook this insult to the authority of Parliament. To have done so would have been political suicide. Even Pitt proclaimed the action of the Boston radicals as criminal, and popular opinion swung firmly behind a policy of retaliatory measures. The result was the enactment of the Coercive Acts and the beginning of the end for England's rule in America. So too began the last humiliating episode in the long history of the Colonial Customs Service. For the Customs Commissioners themselves, the Boston Port Act was at first a repetition of their early experiences in the aftermath of the Liberty seizure and the massacre. They fled to the shelter of the harbor fort, reporting to the Treasury that, as usual, they were the special object of the people's rage. From November 30th to the end of December, they were confined to the fort. At the end of December, they ventured out to hold a meeting in Boston, but confessed frankly to the Treasury Lords that they did not expect to be there long. The commissioners were back in Boston from December 30th, 1773 until June 1774. Then they retreated to Salem. To the very end, the English authorities displayed a fascinating respect for the letter of the law. With the closing of Boston and the transfer of all cargoes formerly destined for that port to Salem, that city became the most active port in Massachusetts. Since it was enacted that none of the necessary supplies could be entered into Boston except via the port of Salem, which included Marblehead. The customs officers formerly stationed in Boston could have been put to good use there. Unfortunately, Salem was not legally included in the port of Boston, so the Boston officers went instead to Plymouth, which was legally part of the Boston district, where they sat idly by with hardly a ship entering that minor port, while the undermined staff in Salem and Marblehead struggled with the increased traffic. Step by step, the open conflict between England and the colonies was drawing closer. During these hectic months, the major concern of the Customs Service was to prevent the importation of supplies of war into the colonies, Dutch gunpowder being the greatest item in this trade. When warned to prevent such goods from reaching the colonists, the Collector and Comptroller in Rhode Island answered that they would do their best, but that the inhabitants had already purchased 300 barrels of Dutch gunpowder and some field pieces as well. They thought the goods were brought from St. Eustatia. Reports from the other colonies told much the same story. Aside from warning their officers to watch for such shipments and to carry on their work as best they might, the commissioners devoted their major energies to the legal problems created by the closing of Boston. From their retreat in Salem, they directed the flow of foodstuffs and supplies into Boston. At times, their insistence on observing the letter of the law irritated the military officers attempting to implement the blockade of Boston. But by the middle of September 1774, in spite of Parliament's order that no customs officers should be in Boston, the commissioners and most of the other customs officers had to flee Salem and take refuge with the army in that city. The countryside was in an uproar, and no member of the despised service was safe beyond the immediate protection of the military. Following the enactment of the Boston Port Act, Parliament passed further retaliatory measures. The Massachusetts Government Act, May 20, 1774, brought an end to the charter government in that colony. The Quartering Act permitted the forceful quartering of English troops wherever necessary. The British were preparing for war, nor were the colonists far behind. The First Continental Congress, presenting a united colonial front, assembled in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774. In April of the next year, the first clash between the royal forces and the colonists occurred at Lexington and Concord. The empty authority of the customs commissioners lingered on into the fall of 1775. By November of that year, Admiral Thomas Graves, commander of the fleet, belatedly informed them that as far as he was concerned, their authority had ended with the declaration of martial law. The commissioners asked the advice of the Treasury, but hardly needed to wait for a reply. All over the colonies, the English administration had been thrown off with little ceremony. The battle at Lexington and Concord, followed by the fight at Bunker Hill, ended whatever hope the conservatives in America had of obtaining a peaceful settlement of the dispute. Both sides were stirred by the news of the open combats. Symptomatic of the seriousness of the breach was the news from New Hampshire. Governor John Wentworth there had always managed to maintain friendly relations with the inhabitants and was himself a popular and respected figure. On May 18, 1775, the Collector and Comptroller of Piscataqua informed the board that they had of necessity taken refuge on a man of war in the harbor. The governor had not yet left the province, but was fortified in his house and preparing for a siege. If Wentworth in New Hampshire could not maintain his authority, there was little hope that any other royal governor could do so. By November 1775, the Comptroller of Philadelphia was in London, reporting that events had put it out of my power of staying in America. Francis Waldo, the collector at Falmouth in Maine and a native of that place, was forced to follow the Philadelphia officers shortly thereafter. One after the other, the customs officers fled from their posts to safety under the protection of the British Army or to England. When early in 1776 the British were forced to evacuate Boston, the commissioners themselves left the colonies, recognizing that, whatever the eventual outcome, for the next few years at least, there was little they could do in America. The commissioners removed first to Halifax. There they discharged all the incidental officers carrying on the salary lists and embarked for England. The departure of the American commissioners signaled the end of the colonial customs service. Officially, the American establishment lingered on until 1783, when the commissioners and the other officers were finally dismissed. Until that time, such as not been provided with other positions in the English service continued to receive their salaries. Not until a final peace treaty was signed and American independence a recognized fact was all hope abandoned and the 110-year history of the colonial service brought to a close.